This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Welcome everyone to today's Economy, Culture and Skills Committee meeting. Thank you for joining us today to discuss the concept of UBI, or Universal Basic Income in London. We will cover the benefits and the drawbacks of UBI, its effectiveness in addressing health and economic security, and specific groups that may benefit. We'll also evaluate the feasibility of a UBI trial and suggest actions for local and central government support. Before we get started, I would like to remind everyone to please switch their phones to silent mode. I also ask the members and guests to position their electronic devices away from their microphones. Also, please adjust your microphones so that you can be heard clearly. If you need to adjust the microphone, remember to lift from the base. Members of the public may like to follow at London Assembly on X using the hashtag Assembly Economy. Can I now ask our committee clerk, Sal Fazal, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies have been received from Assembly members Ahmed and Desai.
Now, I have a few items of business to cover. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare?
Very briefly, it's not pecuniary, but I co-authored a chapter of a book that Professor Johnson wrote.
Okay. Can I propose that we take agenda item 3, 4 and 5 together? Can I ask the committee to note the membership and chairing arrangements, the terms of reference and standing delegations of authority for the Economy, Culture and Skills Committee as agreed by the London Assembly at its annual meeting on the 6th of May 2025? Thank you. Can I ask the committee to confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 11th of March 2025 to be signed by me as a correct record? Yep. Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the completed and closed actions arising from the previous meeting and the additional correspondence sent and received? Thank you. Can we note the actions taken by the former chair of the committee and myself as the current chair under delegated authority following consultation with the party group lead members to agree the committee's reports and letters as outlined in the agenda report? Can I ask the committee to note the response from the Mayor of London to committee's report Early Years and Childcare in London as attached at Appendix 1 of the agenda report? We can now move on to the main item of business, a discussion on the committee's investigation into Universal Basic Income in London. Today's discussion will be divided into 2 panels. I'd like to welcome our guests for the first panel. In the chamber, we have Dr. Elliot Johnson, Vice-Chancellor's Fellow in Public Policy, Northumbria University. Welcome. And we have Professor Guy Standing, who is the Professional Research Associate of the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. Welcome. And online, we have remotely Dr. Otto Leto, the postdoctoral researcher for the New York University. Welcome. And Dr. Will Stronge, who is the Chief Executive of the Autonomy Institute. Thank you all for joining us. Now, I'll be asking the very first question, and it's to all our guests. We'll start with the guests in the chamber. If we can start with you, Guy, and then along to Elliot, and then we'll go to our guests online. Please, can you briefly set out why you are in favour of UBI? I know this is going to be a challenge to do it briefly, but if you can, that would be wonderful. So we'll start with you, Guy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's professorial rather than professional, but I'll take either. I've been advocating basic income since I left university, and we've built up an international network called BIEN. We have members in 45 countries and thousands of people have been involved, and we've done pilots everywhere, a lot of places. And the reason I support basic income, and notice I use the term basic income, not universal basic income, and my book is called Basic Income, Not Universal. And the reason we say that is that we believe that it should be a modest amount paid regularly, unconditionally, individually, without conditions, for every member of a community. And that means, in practice, every usual legal resident, whether it's London or wherever it might be. I don't use the term universal because that incites criticism. Well, you'd let every migrant come into the country and to London and they'd all get it? No, we don't mean that. We mean that it's a member of the community, a commoner, if you like. And I think it's important to make that distinction. If you want migrants, which I do, then you would treat them differently in the sense that they would have help, but they wouldn't be eligible for the basic income until they'd been in the country or the community for a certain amount of time. That's an issue for discussion. Now, the reasons I support a basic income, and I've always done this, is ethical, not instrumental. Fundamentally important that it's a matter of common justice, for a start. It's a matter of ecological justice. It's a matter of religious justice if you're religious. And common justice starts from the premise that if we allow the private inheritance of private wealth, which I think everybody does, which is a lot of something for nothing for a very small minority, in a sense, a basic income can be interpreted as a share of the public wealth created over many, many generations. And we don't know whose ancestors and parents and grandparents contributed more or less, and therefore having a common dividend as a justification is a start. The second, on religious justice, I was very interested in COVID. When COVID struck, I was contacted by a committee of the Vatican, and I was told that the Pope was thinking of coming out in favor of basic income, and he ended up writing a very interesting public letter where he basically says that whether we're believers or not, we share the world, and everybody is entitled to have a share. And I like that argument. I think it's perfectly feasible. The third part about justice is that ecological justice is needed in the 21st century. The rich do most of the pollution. The poor suffer the consequences of polluted air, polluted water, polluted atmosphere, and pay the price. I believe very strongly in paying for a basic income through eco-fiscal policies, taxing those who are taking from the commons and polluting, and using that as a fund to pay out a sort of compensation. I think that's a good argument. I've elaborated on that. The second reason, ethical reason, is that a basic income, unlike means-tested benefits, and behavior tested benefits, enhances freedom. It enhances libertarian freedom, the freedom to choose. That's why Milton Friedman came round to supporting it in his latter years. It supports liberal freedom, the freedom to be moral, to be able to make decisions because I think it's the right thing to do. People who are chronically insecure don't have that freedom. And the third is Republican freedom, the freedom to look another person in the eye as an equal. And that is very important. A woman doesn't have freedom if she has to ask her husband or father if she can do X, Y, and Z, even though she may know that 99% of the time he will say yes. A woman is only free if she can make that decision herself without fear of retribution. So for me, enhancing freedom is important. And the final ethical reason is that it would enhance, even if it's at a lower level than what any of us would like, it would enhance basic security. Basic security is a human need. It is also a public good. And the great thing about it is I'm an economist, it's a superior public good in that if everybody has basic security, it's more valuable to everybody. And we know, the psychologists have taught us, that people who are chronically insecure suffer a shrinking of the mental bandwidth, a shrinking of the capacity to be rational. And it is unfair of the state to say you must behave this way or that way when your insecurity has made you less intelligent, if you like, than you would otherwise be. It's fundamentally important, basic security. For me, this is so important, and I'll come back to it later.
Thank you. Thank you. You have to follow that now, Elliot. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to take a different approach, and I have a whole range of research reasons to support basic income. And I'm somewhat of a convert to basic income. Now, I come from a background that's very unusual among academics, which is that I come from a family that was welfare dependent when I was growing up. And I come from an extended family that was welfare dependent, is welfare dependent. So I've experienced the problems of the current system. And I think at the time, I probably would have said that some things could be changed. Could be assessments could change. There could be ways of better accounting for differences. And over time, I've seen a system that's tried to do that, and it's compounded problems repeatedly. That none of the reforms of the last 20, 30 years have been effective. And all of those reforms have gone in the direction of tightening eligibility criteria, of trying to reduce the number of people who are eligible. Now, as we've seen over the last 10, 15 years, and especially over the pandemic, people who were previously would have thought of themselves as very secure, having high income, jobs that they would never imagine that they would lose, suddenly lost them. Overnight, we're getting people who are like high-paid lawyers, teachers. We're talking about huge swathes of the population were suddenly without work. The benefit system isn't set up to look after working people. This is the great irony of it. A more universal system is the one that can accommodate that and that can look after the whole population. By reducing and tightening eligibility, all you're doing is compounding the problems that I think people on all points of the spectrum have. So this is no longer a system that supports the worst off, but it's also not a system that supports anyone else. The people who remain are the ones who can navigate the system, the people who have the resources to be able to challenge things, to go over time and to challenge decisions. It's just not a very effective reform. So I'm a convert to it. And I guess in some ways I have an ethical perspective on it, but I think I do have an instrumental perspective on this, which is that it's a system that is fit for the 21st century. And I don't think any alternative that's currently in place is. That's not to say we can't improve the current system, but I don't think anything can be as effective as getting rid of all of the perverse incentives, perverse disincentives, loopholes that are inherent in the current tax benefit system.
We'll move on to our guests online. We'll start with Will.
Thank
If you can just briefly set out why you're in favour.
Yes, and apologies, I'm online. I hope my internet connection holds. Thanks to the two previous speakers. I agree with all of the ethical arguments that Guy's put forward, like Elliot, I also believe that the instrumental, let's say, the kind of outcomes-based arguments are fundamental here. Without going through them all, and I feel bad for Otto going last, having had heard all the other reasons. I think there's the context in which we live in, the world in which we live in, the last 15, 20 years has been shock-driven, crisis-driven. Crisis is the new normal for many people, whether it's COVID, whether it's inflation, whether it's the financial crash. And that kind of crisis-ridden world creates huge insecurity, huge uncertainty. And I think the welfare system, the current welfare system, the one which is based on basically a post-World War II age, the fact that it has these behavior tests, these means tests, which ask people, are you looking for a job? What's your moral worth, and so on, simply inadequate to our era, and as we've just heard. So I think that kind of shock-driven world, one which will continue with the ecological crisis, with shifting geopolitical plates, and so on. What is the welfare system that we need for this moment? And it's one which I believe is unconditional, which has a universality based on residency. Has that kind of floor to stand on, rather than one which has all these cracks, and then we create new systems to kind of secure underneath these cracks and so on. It is time for a radical reform, and I think this is why, for me, the fundamental reason is simply the context in which we exist. One extra reason I'd like to give, which I think is particularly underrepresented in the debates around welfare and the debates around social security. It's not really an economic argument. It's one really around innovation and culture. And I think it's really fundamental that we recognize, as I'm sure a lot of us have, that when we look back at the 20th century and we think about what the kind of most innovative moments of culture and art and so on have been, there have been times where we've had free art schools, less punitive welfare systems, and so on. And if we do want to have that kind of more enriched social fabric, then we can't be kind of having a disciplinary, kind of very punitive welfare system that we have now. We need to have one which is kind of supports people to allow them to kind of express themselves in that way. And I think alongside the economic outcomes and the health outcomes, and we've got all the research for that, I think it's important to note that when we have, a stronger floor to stand on, we have a much richer social life. I think that's fundamental.
Thank you so much. And Otto, you're next. And I'm sorry that you're last, because it's probably the hardest to be last in this, but thank you so much.
No worries. Thank you for having me. And I have to agree with a lot of my esteemed colleagues, so I will not be repeating the points. I will just be kind of stressing kind of an agreement and also a bit of an emphasis that I have. So I agree with the emphasis on justice. I think that it's very important to think about a new framework for social contract for the next 100 years. We need to have kind of a empowerment attitude to rights, where we grant capacities, powers, freedoms, autonomy to citizens to really enable them to participate in social life fully. And to do that, I think we need to have this kind of material support that is combined with formal freedom, that it is combined with the right to do with the money what people want. And I think that's going to be a very empowering thing, to have that as the foundation for social life going forward, if we can get there. Because I think it combines the sort of justice perspective with the efficiency perspective in a very unique way. Because I think the new sort of foundation we need is one that does not feel the need to have a big trade-off between freedom and security, but finds a way to combine freedom and security. And I think UBI gets close as possible. There's always going to be trade-offs, right? How high we get and all those things. We're going to discuss those things, but I think the foundation is one that tries to get the most out of the freedom side of things and most out of the security side of things. And I think UBI gets there a lot. And I also emphasize that it is a really good foundation for a world that is rapidly changing and unpredictable. And we need a foundation that's capable of carrying us through very unpredictable terrain. And I think that's why we need sort of an unconditional foundation for that.
Thank you so much. We are going to be moving to the other Assembly members who are going to be asking some additional questions. We have Assembly Member Georgie who just wants to come in very quickly.
Yeah, Professor Standing, I don't want to spend too long on this, but it was just based on your opening remarks. So it clearly, from what you've said, and I hope I've inferred this correctly, you were looking for wealth taxes because you focus a lot of your comments on inherited wealth, which you believe is something that's not right. But then why stop there? Inheritance tax. Why not? Because at the moment, the current tax system allows my father, I grew up in a one-bedroom flat in Edmonton, so he's not in the position to do this, but he can give me £1 million tomorrow if he wanted to. Why wait until he dies? So I guess my point is, how well thought through is this system of wealth taxes, if not to rely on waiting for someone to die?
Thank you for the question. I'm not aware that I have actually put weight on wealth taxes. I believe in an eco-fiscal policy in the sense that those who are causing the pollution and are taking from common resources owe it to the commoners, that's all of us, some sort of compensation. I believe in a carbon tax, for example. I think heavy duty should be put on a carbon tax. I believe in tackling what I've called in my books rentier capitalism that we have today. Rentier capitalism is different from classic capitalism in the sense that it's based on the ultra protection of private property rights, particularly intellectual property and financial rights. And more of the income is going to the owners of property, physical, financial, intellectual property. And less is going to those who are relying on labour and work. And notice I make a distinction between labour and work. And I really want to come back to that. The essence of it would be to build a fund, a capital fund, a commons capital fund. That's how I would approach it. Now, I have 17 forms of eco-fiscal policy, and I would go for that route. But others would go for increased income tax or increased VAT or whatever. I think that that's a political decision that's taken separately. My own preference, because of common justice, is to go for the sort of things I've just been talking about. So I hope that gives you an answer. But I've elaborated that particularly in my new book, The Politics of Time, in the final chapter.
No, thank you very much. And just to come back to that point, I think basically what you're saying is that many people that have the same views of you as you on UBI, there is not one collective view on how to provide those funds to fund the scheme. I mean, there's no sort of common consensus amongst the community.
No, I think I can say that there's a shift that's taken place in the international debates towards paying through a commons capital fund. Alaska Permanent Fund is the case, which pays out a basic income. The new president of Korea, who's a member of our network, and we're the first president we've had elected from our network, he favours a commons fund as a way for paying every Korean a basic income. And the Norwegian fund is the case I mentioned in the book, which is also... But there are other ways, and you're perfectly correct in saying that there's a debate there. One of the biggest sources of paying for it in Britain is to roll back the 1,190 forms of tax relief, which are incredibly regressive, and which the Treasury themselves, they can't estimate how much income is lost, but of the 209 biggest, they reckon it costs the Treasury £400 billion a year. Now, you can roll back a lot of those because they're highly regressive. There's no evaluation that's been done on practically all of them. No evaluation, even though many of them have been going for years. And they're distortions in the market system. So whether you're left or right, it's hard to justify those subsidies. I think you can get a lot of the necessary income that way.
Thank you. It was just to touch on your initial remarks, but I know we're coming back to this later, so thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So we're going to go to Assembly Member Polanski next.
Thank you, Chair. Elliot, if I can start with you. You talked about people in poverty, and also obviously economic inequality is huge, both in the UK but particularly in London. How effective would UBI deal with tackling poverty, economic inequality, and in particular in-work poverty as well?
So this is the interesting thing about basic income, is that I think the instinctive reaction to everyone receives a payment is that therefore it's not very targeted. Now, in fact, you accompany the payment of basic income with changes elsewhere in the tax benefit system. So it actually ends up as being a really efficient, effective way of reducing poverty and inequality. So we modelled 3 schemes, and we had a starter, an intermediate, and a full minimum income standard scheme, which is the amount of money that people think is needed to participate in society fully. The first scheme, which is £50 a week for a child, £75 a week for a working age adult, and £205 for a pensioner, which is about the current rate, that reduces inequality and poverty to sort of lowest levels in the post-1961 era. Now, it does that effectively fiscally neutrally. So you change things like you remove you lower the tax-free personal allowance, because it's quite an inefficient way of administering a tax system and creates disincentives. You know, even for higher income people, there's a point where that starts to be withdrawn. So you get to 100,000 and you're suddenly thinking about these things. So you can convert all of these quite arcane systems into something much more straightforward that's far more effective and targeted, but also protects working people by instituting a quite modest basic income. But that then creates spending multipliers. So we're about to release a report that suggests that current spending, so day-to-day spending that the government puts in, over 25 countries between 1996 and 2019, produces returns for the economy for every £1 of £1.35 at its peak. So you get into a situation where a lot of that initial investment comes back to the government. So it's not as expensive as you might expect, and that's a key thing to address the previous question as well. But more than that, it's incredibly effective at addressing the problems we have, both for people out of work, but especially for people in work. They currently have effectively no protection once you reach a certain level, especially in London, where incomes are on average higher. So, you know, people who are really affected by a very high rent system via housing costs aren't getting the necessary income to be able to stay afloat from the current benefit system. This is a much more straightforward system without any of the disincentives that a conditional system has.
Thank you. And Professor Standing, I know you talk about the precariat. Who benefits from this in terms of a universal basic income, or a basic income, sorry?
Yeah, thank you for the information for the other members of the committee. I wrote a book in 2011 called The Precariat, the New Dangerous Class, and it's been translated into 25 languages, and every single day I get emails from people around the world saying, I'm a member of the precariat. And basically, people, millions of people, are suffering from chronic insecurity, labour insecurities. They have to do a lot of work for labour, work for the state. They don't have control of their time. They don't have any access to secure state benefits, guaranteed benefits, and they don't have a sense of being in control of their incomes. They are living on the edge of unsustainable debt. One error, one accident, they're out in the streets. And they're the first mass class that is actually losing the rights of citizenship. They're not just the migrants losing, it's all people in the precariat. If I give a talk to an audience of the precariat, they all put their hands up and say, yeah, I can give you example after example after example. So we have a situation where people in the precariat are chronically insecure, and they're suffering from the 4 A's I describe in my book: anomie, alienation, anxiety, and anger. And on page 1 of that book, on 2011, I said, unless the politicians address the needs and insecurities of the precariat, we're going to see the emergence of a political monster. And in 2016, I was invited to the Bilderberg Group to address them in Bremen. And I sat next to Peter Thiel, who is the main funder of Trump, and Lindsey Graham, who wanted to have a long discussion with me. And I said, you people understand the precariat, and it's an alliance that's going to lead to Trump winning. Okay? And I've received a deluge of emails and contacts from all over the world. And then we now have a Plutarchy. In this book I did for proposing a basic income pilot, and I'll table this, I had 8 giants that I said, taking on beverages, 5 giants, if you remember, 8 giants. And the 8th one is the fear, or the 7th one is the fear of populism. Unless you offer hope and security for people, don't be surprised if we see reform becoming the major party in this country. I've seen it in other countries where I've worked in the United Nations for many, many years. So I've worked in many countries. I've just come back from Malaysia. If people are in fear, and those people who don't have a lot of education, they will listen to the populists promising to bring back yesterday. And none of us should be surprised unless we are offering security for people. Many of those will turn to reform. I've just come back from before I went to Malaysia, North Yorkshire, where I was invited to talk. They're all talking of fear of reform suddenly sweeping the board. And it's all because people feeling insecure and resentful. We should realize that we're in a transformational moment where the urgency of giving people basic security is something fundamental. And that's where I stand today.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
That's quite a moment. Assemblymember Garrett. Yeah.
To the microphone. One of the so the question really is about tackling inequality and poverty, and one of the obvious concerns, sort of thinking like an economist, if you put a significant amount of extra cash in, particularly in a particular group of people, is you then generate additional purchasing power for those people across the board, and you create inflation. So obviously we've just seen that. In effect, furlough was a sort of form of basic income, and as a surprise to nobody, we then saw a very severe impact of significant inflation impacting people's cost of living, in addition to, insecurity that made that worse. So how would you avoid this? I'm not sure whether Guy or Elliot would prefer to answer this. How would you avoid it just turning into inflation? And in particular, you were talking, perhaps Guy, you were talking earlier about the rentier capitalism. It seems to me landlords would be an obvious recipient of additional cash. If a whole group of people suddenly have more money, why would their landlords not then put their rent up and harvest the additional cash, which would then not achieve the thing that you're setting out to achieve?
So I think in terms of inflation, that has been over recent years, I would say that's been under the current system. So there was a point where furlough ended. And as far as I'm aware, the furlough actually didn't directly lead to an inflationary spike. What led to that was supply of oil at very high prices, of food due to constraint of supply, things that people can't avoid purchasing. So what do? Well, you have a whole of government approach. So
sorry, just to be clear then on the basic economics, you don't think the government, all governments, not just this government or previously government, borrowing very large amounts of money and then pumping that directly into people's bank accounts, you don't think that was a cause of inflation?
So at the time, those people were going to lose their jobs, so there wasn't an increase in supply.
To be clear, I'm not arguing it was the wrong thing to do. I think we're in a position where there were only bad options. So one option is let people become destitute and starve to death. Another option was furlough. Furlough is clearly the better of those two. But borrowing a large amount of money and giving it directly to people who then spend it, that's obviously inflationary, isn't it?
No, not necessarily. So we have a whole of government approach in Act Now, a book we brought out last year as a Common Sense Policy Group. The thing is that a lot of the things that caused that inflation were people having to buy things. It's not luxury goods that people have a choice over. So what do? Well, you ensure that there's a supply of cheap, plentiful energy. And you do that through a transition to net zero that's far more rapid than the current government is planning. For housing, you ensure that there's public housing available that competes with the private sector and reduces prices for everyone while driving up standards. We had that in the 1970s. It was very, very effective. On the other hand, we have basic income options that don't require you to borrow more money. So this is about a redistribution of funds. It's not necessarily about borrowing lots of money to create it. Now, for example, if you start on a starter scheme, you have the returns on investment from a starter scheme through the spending multipliers I mentioned in the report we're releasing today. That gives you that gives you a larger economy with more tax coming in to fund higher schemes. They then have further multiplier effects. You also need to invest in capital at the same time, so you need to invest in really significant infrastructure projects. They have a much higher spending multiplier of 2.99 in year 9. So these are ways that you can obtain funding without even increasing borrowing to fund a basic income. That's a redistribution. On the other hand, I think there's a good case to borrow to invest. We had a decade between 2010 and 2020 where borrowing was at extremely low rates. Instead, we cut spending severely. Multiplier effects work both ways. So the cuts have a spending multiplier, a negative spending multiplier for the economy. That caused incalculable damage. The big problem is that government doesn't put forward a narrative of how this can be beneficial. So in terms of the spending review we've just had, we must put in £30 billion a year into the NHS in order to avoid it collapsing. Not we must put in more in order to improve people's health so that they don't need services as much downstream. So there is a point where you can say we should be looking at ways of introducing new money to ensure that services aren't overloaded for a long-term benefit. Unfortunately, the Office for Budget Responsibility is very, very poor at assessing those long-term gains. In fact, there are assumptions that they've made that say that there are no gains in year 5. Now, that's a methodological problem that is in that. So I think it's really important that we challenge the OBR. Equally, the government can change its fiscal rules. We set out economic rules and much longer-term economic rules that give you the freedom not to have to respond constantly to international crises to say that we have a plan. Unfortunately, we never have a plan that lasts more than 2 years.
If you forget, I don't want to interrupt your flow, but my question obviously was specifically about UBI and inflation, and you're sort of, here's how we re-engineer the entire economy. And I appreciate there is an element of that in what you're proposing, but equally the chair at some point intervenes and says, Neil, can you move on? So thank you, Elliot. Guy, you wanted to come in on this. Again, let me remind you, it's not...
We also have Otto online as well, but we do need to speed up, Assembly members. We've got less than an hour to get through 9 questions.
Okay. Let me
just clarify my question. It was about
inflation.
Would a UBI create inflation, and in particular, would it just end up being harvested by, or substantially by, say,
No,
rent?
I want to make 3 quick points. First, nobody sensibly says that the basic income is a panacea for every ailment in society. It obviously requires, in the case of landlords, you would probably want rent control or some sort of policy. I'm not necessarily in favour or not, but that's the argument. The second thing is you're talking about expenditure switching, because you're talking about paying for it from taxes, whatever tax regime you choose, and increasing demand. The great thing about a basic income is it increases demand for basic goods and services in the local communities, and therefore the multiplier effect tends to be much higher. Whereas the higher income people import more. We did a huge pilot in India covering 12,000 individuals. And Sonia Gandhi asked to see us before we launched it, and she said, well, they'll all waste it and it'll cause inflation, just like you've said. After 2 years, the prices in all those local communities were lower than at the beginning. And the reason was that it had stimulated investment in local goods and services. So the unit prices came down, even though their profits went up. So it actually has a beneficial effect. And I summarise results in many countries which have shown the multiplier effects are actually potentially, not always, potentially deflationary rather than inflationary in terms of prices.
Okay. I mean, the economic theory of demand stimulating supply and keeping prices in check, I observe that doesn't seem to be happening much in the housing market. But in the interest of time, Otto, you wanted to come in on this inflation question.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, look, I think the evidence is, it's quite clear that UBI experiments have not been shown to cause inflation. But I agree that in general, pumping money, into the economy is the lead cause of inflation. And I definitely am a bit worried about some of the proposals, not today necessarily, but in the debate where people have become more lax about worrying about that effect. And I do think that any responsible UBI scheme has to be tax reform at the same time that is fully funded, that does not pump at least much new money into the economy. But I still worry that the special problem of landlords needs to be dealt with. And I do worry that there's a local inflation effect possibility, especially if you increase the purchasing power of people in the lower quintiles. So I do think that for the issue of landlords, I disagree with my esteemed colleagues about the solutions proposed here. I don't think that the solution is rent control. I don't think the solution is more public housing. I think the solution is more supply of housing, deregulation of the housing sector, and allowing for much more flexible housing system. At the same time, I do think that, speaking of the financial side of things, you could think about having a land value tax that controls for some of that and actually can increase competition and keep the prices down while also generating revenue for potential UBI on a city level.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Chair.
We are going to have to rattle through quite a few questions. So, Assembly Member Clark, thank you.
Thank you. I'm known for being able to rattle through, so delighted to have the next question. I'm going to go to Will and Otto online. Just some view UBI as necessary, given the advances in AI and automation. To what extent do you agree with this?
Shall I go first, Otto? Great. Thanks for the question. Yes, I think the issue is obviously complex and nuanced. There have been arguments around the oncoming kind of jobs apocalypse, so-called, and other kind of sci-fi scenarios for many years, many decades. I think this round of AI technologies, large language models, vector embeddings, things like that, transformer-based AI, is slightly different to the kind of image of AI that we've had in the past, basically. And I think what seems to be emerging is that the real losers from this new influx of technology into the labour market are really new entrants to the labour market. So new cognitive workers that are entering the labour market. We can always categorize, we can try and categorize work in terms of cognitive, manual, routine, non-routine. And it's really the routine and non-routine cognitive workers, new entrants to the labour market, those who might be doing kind of either interns or they are starting kind of with basic data work, basic coding, for example. We're seeing a real drop-off in the hiring of that kind of level. So you might call them low-skilled. I don't like to use that term, but let's say those who've just entered the labour market in that sense. So we are seeing a negative effect on those new entrants, particularly in the US labour market. But of course, that work is ubiquitous across particularly the global north and or increasingly the global south. So in that sense, I can see, those kind of disruptions, they can see the argument for sure around having a more stable social security net. However, as I say, I think what's more certain in the coming years and decades are disruptions through to supply chain shortages, extreme weather events, the dynamics of an aging population, and so on and so forth. Those things are baked in. Those things are going to be happening. Do we need a welfare system that, in those kind of disruptive moments, and if we are going to have a green industrial transition, there are going to be jobs lost. Do we want a welfare system which asks people about their behaviour, about looking for any job's a good job, and so on? No, we probably need a system which actually supports people through those moments. We saw lots of retroactive action. I mean, the Assembly member said furlough was a basic income scheme. I don't agree with that, but we do see that action happens retroactively can be often done hastily. What we need is a system where you have the taps ready, a crisis hits, it could be a technological crisis, an automation crisis, who knows? We need this tax rate to turn the taps on to allow for that floor to be there, so we don't have huge amounts of people going into unemployment. We do have people, and that being something which is terrible for health outcomes, for economic outcomes, and so on. We need an economic floor, so when those crises hit, we have some kind of stabilizer. And I think that's a really important point.
Okay, thank you. Otto.
Thank you very much. Well, I agree with Will with a lot of what we said. So I agree that the problem is the insecurity and the uncertainty and the polycrisis situation that we face. So it's going to be a lot of different challenges, risks that need to be bundled together into the same sort of response mechanisms. That is, you need to have, the more you can sort of like build in these powers and securities to people that can respond to whatever threat they face, the more you can sort of deal with also the upcoming AI challenges. I actually have done a kind of U-turn on this issue. I used to be, a couple of years ago, I felt like the tying of UBI to the AI job apocalypse was probably not that important, but I actually have now come around to it, and I think that it probably is one of the biggest issues we need to face. But I always knew that AI would be a chaos mechanism. It's a disruptor, right? So it's at the very least, regardless of whether it leads to permanent job loss, it's going to create a lot of transitory problems, a lot of issues of sectoral, industrial, transition from one employment sector to another, a lot of part-time work and all kinds of things, that precarity, as Guy Standing has rightfully emphasized. So all of these things mean that that UBI, I think, is well equipped to handle the radical uncertainty, as the great economist Frank Knight calls it, of the upcoming AI threat. So again, I think unemployment is not what we should be planning for, but we should be planning for a chaotic world that demands adaptive capacities and capacities of flexibility from its people and its institutions.
Thank you.
Assemblymember Garrett.
Yeah, so I suppose the question for perhaps Otto and Will, is there a danger that sorry, Otto and Will. Sorry, I mean, I'm not going to forbid you from coming in, but well, the problem is they're everywhere, aren't they, in this chamber? So I was actually pointing at the screen, which is just behind you. Apologies. So effectively becoming a public sector subsidy for low-wage businesses. So in other words, it would allow businesses to pay what is effectively a sub-market wage to some staff, which, because their real wage is being topped up by some form of UBI or BI, it effectively becomes a kind of state subsidy for those employers. Is that a realistic concern? I mean, in a sense, it's more of what we have already, but presumably with a higher level of income, it would become worse. So, Will, perhaps we'll start with you. Is that a real concern, and what would we do about it?
Thank you. It's not a real concern for me, because I think in this country in particular, we have one of the most punitive welfare systems, which is a real stick to those in the labour market, never mind those outside the labour market. So as you say, right now, small businesses do tend to pay lower wages. Let's say that kind of like, it's harder, for example, for there to be, we have a kind of a union-based system. The union system in this country is not sectoral, which means that you have lots of kind of micro units, which means that it's hard for there to be lots of kind of, let's say, bargaining power. Therefore, wages often tend to be not particularly high. With a basic income, even a modest basic income, with that known security, I think that automatically unlocks, and this is what Guy was alluding to in his opening comments, that unlocks a perspective to say, well, actually, I know that I don't need to be here. I know I don't have a 5-week wait for my universal credit. I know that the amount is going to be regular and guaranteed. I think that adds a lot of, let's say, confidence and pushback to the low wages that already exist. So it's not really a concern for me, I don't think. I think in many ways it can only get better.
Okay. Perhaps I would add that I don't think it's only small businesses that try to pay low wages. Otto.
That's a very good question. No, I think that's not a big worry. First of all, UBI is perfectly compatible with people doing full-time work as well. And so it really depends on the empirical circumstances where people end up in the long run. And in fact, I mean, one of the things we want to do is encourage a growth economy that is capable of producing as many jobs for as many people as possible. And UBI would still be relevant in a world like that, because you still want to have security between jobs and for all kinds of life circumstances that people have. Now, for the small business thing, I think it's much better that if the government has to subsidize anybody, it subsidizes small businesses rather than no businesses, which it does under many current schemes. I mean, it subsidizes people not working, which is a much more perverse situation. So again, I think UBI should be seen as something that's compatible with a lot of different work arrangements, so it should not be seen as sectorally targeted to any particular area. Of course, empirically, it could turn out that people end up going to these kind of arrangements, but again, it's still much better than them not working at all.
Okay, thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Assemblymember Polanski.
Thank you. Guy, just in terms of gathering evidence, can I put two criticisms to you to rattle off a kind of responses to? So one is, and you alluded to it earlier, that a universal basic income, an adequate one, would be unaffordable because it would just be too much money, whereas, sorry, let me put that another way. So a common criticism is an affordable UBI is not adequate and an adequate UBI is not affordable, is one of them. And the second one is around universal basic services. So people accept the arguments about poverty and welfare, but say, why not do services rather than basic income?
Well, on the second point, I'm not a fan of universal basic services. I think it's very paternalistic. I don't know what you need. You don't know what I need. To say we're going to have universal bus services that are free or something. What about those who have tubes, who want to go on tube or bicycle? And the same with universal basic food. I don't know how you would operate it. I think this is very paternal. I worked in the Soviet Union at the end of the 1980s, and I saw what universal basic services are like. They're basic, and you get lousy quality. So on that point, I think on the other thing, I think what we've found is that even a low amount that you would not want yourself or your loved ones to be receiving makes a difference. If, for example, you gave £100 a week to a mother of a small child, a single parent, and she's desperate, that means a lot. It wouldn't provide a basic income in the sense that we've seen in the Welsh pilot that we've just concluded, but it would make a difference. And the great thing is to move in the direction. I always say the important thing now is to be on the road to giving everybody basic security, not going against it. Now, universal credit has moved decisively against giving people security. Huge exclusion errors, huge punitive, huge sanctions, no due process. And we have a system which is causing suicides, incredible stress, and huge increase in insecurity and poverty. We've got to move away from that. Now, what's the optimum amount? I don't know, okay? But I think that moving in that direction, first, we do know that small amounts lead to people working more, not less. Whether you go up to a certain level and it changes, we don't know, to be honest. But we've now seen over 100 pilots and experiments. And when people receive a modest amount, it reduces stress, it increases health, mental health in particular, it increases work, it increases schooling, and it has beneficial effects on women's status and the disabled and so on. So I think the important thing is to be moving in that direction. And the advantage is, if you're a free market person or if you're a socialist person, the advantages of a people's well-being. And that's what it should be all about.
We're going to go to Will, who's online, and then we're going to have to move on to the next question. Thank you. Will.
Thanks. Just very briefly, two points. One is that, yes, basically the kind of, even on the modest amounts, the kind of modelling by Howard Reed and Stuart Lansley has shown that, two parents, two kids, you get an extra £10,000 a year. That's huge, even on very modest amounts. So I think it's really important to not just dismiss just the kind of introductory or modest level. And the second point, I am a fan of universal basic services defined in a specific way, but I don't think we should be counterposing the two schemes. Basically, I think they provide basically fundamentally different goods. We don't argue that we shouldn't have a social security system because we have the NHS. We don't do that. Of course, we need both. Buses, health, and so on. There are fundamental things which could be provided best as a service, but there are many things which we do need to have that freedom, that kind of consumption freedom, whether it's the clothes we buy, going to the pub, going to a kid's birthday party. So I think we do need that kind of the freedom that cash gives, as well as the freedom, or let's say the efficiency of buses, trains, tubes, and so on. And I don't quite agree with the guy's characterization of UBS. And I think it's an unfortunate debate that we have to have every time when we talk about the two UBs. And actually, of course, they complement each other. Thank you.
Great. Assembly Member Georgines, and if we can all focus our questions just on one panel guest from now on.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Dr. Johnson, the current welfare system has been criticised for its complexity and the number of resources required to administer it. Can this be simplified without depriving people of financial assistance? I mean, basically, if you could keep your answer short, but in the context of UBI, that would be helpful.
The key thing is that we've created almost the worst of everything. It's a very complex tax benefit system that we have, and it's also something that doesn't give people protection. So there are loads of disincentives, loopholes. People on higher incomes start to think about disincentives to earning more. People on low incomes think about disincentives to work and to play an active role in society. So the point about basic income is that it streamlines that. You no longer have this massive, huge, harmful and expensive assessment regime. You get rid of that completely. On the other hand, you make sure that people are receiving it whether they're in or out of work. So there isn't that point where there's this transition. So yes, fundamentally, it streamlines the system significantly. As I say, you convert things like the personal allowance to part of the payment. So that removes a huge number of problems with the current system, the income tax system. You can do things like reforming local tax, change it to a proportional one, so people aren't paying all of their money up front when they move. There's a huge way that you can reform tax to go alongside the benefit system.
But leaving aside the taxing for a bit, well, I think we've covered it quite extensively. But with regard to the welfare system, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, as I've understood what you've said, effectively we would dismantle the welfare state in favour of UBI.
It's a pathway to it. So for the starter scheme, you have much of the current welfare system in place, and it's neutral in the first round with a few small changes. You then ramp up to a bigger payment that's more universal. But the starting point is that the basic income's there no matter what. Now, that's really important for disabled people in particular. Disabled people face a system where they can face complete ruin overnight due to changes in policy. The welfare reforms that are going through at the minute are an example of that.
So my final very quick question, which is part of my concern around this, is that, listen, I'm no fan of how the current welfare state is structured. I think it's ridiculous, convoluted, and the money goes to a lot of people that don't deserve it, and those that do deserve it don't often get it in an easy way. I think we can all agree on that point. But is part of the problem, everyone around this table as Assembly members is on a very good wage. Our wages are public, everybody knows what they are. I don't need UBI. But then again, I'm able to afford the basic services that I need to live my life for me and my wife and my children. But somebody that is lower down the spectrum that would only survive on UBI, all of their expenses, going back to Assemblymember Garrett's point, would go to their landlord, would go on to basic goods, and therefore, without the welfare system saying this is for your housing, this is for that, your transport, whatever, those on the lower end of the scale would effectively be in the same position that they were before, would they not?
No. So this is the fundamental thing. You can't separate the tax and benefit system. It is one system. One is income coming in, one is going out. It's part of the same ledger. This is a problem that it's being separated in people's minds, but it's fundamental to it. It's
not
connected.
Everyone on welfare works.
Sorry?
Not everyone on welfare works. So you're talking about tax and income. There are
no,
people
but
that do not have tax and income.
They're still liable for tax at some point. So there is a point where they are affected by, if they go into work, there is a tax system in place.
Yeah, but if they go into work, I'm not talking about people in work. I'm talking people on welfare that are not working.
That are not work. Well, they no longer have a disincentive from taking up work if there's an unconditional payment. There is currently a huge disincentive, and I'm someone who used to be in receipt of employment support allowance. There is a huge disincentive to potentially losing a lot of your income overnight.
Oh, I haven't disagreed with you on that point, by the way.
Yeah.
But we'll leave it there. I think you've answered very comprehensively, so thank you, and we'll move on, Chair. Thank you.
Assemblymember Garrett.
I'm interested in the question of eligibility, which I think, if I put a question to you, Guy, because you did touch on this in your opening remarks, to sort of call back to that. And I'm conscious that you deliberately said you didn't use the universal in universal basic income, but obviously lots of other people are using that. I suppose the question is, how do you, in broad brush terms, I know you said there's a debate about some of this, but how do you determine who realistically is eligible? You talked about community. How do you determine who is eligible? Sort of who's in and who's out, if you like, without either, you talked earlier about the obvious criticism that, the whole world would want to come here and claim their free income. That's one obvious downside on the one hand. And obviously, on the other hand, the obvious problem would be to create effectively a two-tier labour market where lots of people who are legally working in the UK but aren't British citizens wouldn't be eligible for it, and therefore they would gain none of the benefits that people have advocated this morning for doing it. So how do you sort of square that circle?
I think idealistically, if I was a philosopher king, as it were, I would want everybody to have a basic income as a right, an economic right. But pragmatically and politically, one would obviously have to have restrictions. That's where I start from. I think that anybody who comes into London, lives in London, would have to be living in London for a year or more before they become eligible to start receiving the basic income. The eligibility could be worked out. It would be a political decision on it. I think we should emphasize that I certainly wouldn't dismantle the whole welfare system. I mean, that becomes really revolutionary. I think you're talking about a reformist point of view. And in that regard, without doubt, we would keep disability benefits, okay, without a doubt, except that they should be needs-based and costs-based, because what we believe is giving everyone equal basic material starting point, as it were, an anchor. And I think that's key. So disability benefits would be a supplement automatically with a basic income. I don't believe in work capability tests and that sort of stuff. I think that leads to poverty traps and all sorts of problems of exclusion. But the eligibility is something that should be seen as a common right. And I think that would increase a sense of social solidarity. If you have a means-tested system, you set them against us.
So
that
part, I think we've explored already. But I'm interested in, because obviously at some point you have to draw the line and say these people are in what you've termed the community and these people are not. And for the reason that you've pointed out, it's pretty obvious that you couldn't say anybody who lands on, I don't know, Folkestone in a dinghy immediately becomes entitled to it. It's
Correct.
Pretty obvious why that becomes a massive pull factor. But at the same time, there are lots of people who are working in London or elsewhere in the UK who are legally working here, who are entitled to work here, or students, for example. And has work been, or perhaps someone else has got a thought on this, but it's about where you draw that line between who's in and who's out. And I suppose my thought is, perhaps I'll make a provocative before you come in, Elliot, is that it seems to me that when I think about the politics of the kind of progressive people who quite like this idea, they probably don't like the idea that we say, here are these people who are in the UK who are part of, in inverted commas, our community, but they're not part of this, they're not part of us, they're not eligible. But on the other hand, if you don't say that, then everyone's in and the whole thing becomes a kind of global thing. So, Elliot.
Can I just answer that?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, we've done pilots where the whole of a community receives it, and you have to have a practical definition. The definition we've used is that anybody is a usual resident of the place. I'm a British citizen, I work in Europe, and therefore I would not be eligible to be receiving the basic income. Okay, but if I was a usual resident of London, and I'd been living here, you can say 3 months or 6 months beforehand, then I would be eligible. But otherwise, you wouldn't be eligible where you're working, as it were.
Not to prolong my question, but it seems to me that creates an obvious kind of underground market in fake accommodation in London, where people who live not in London claim to live in London because there's suddenly a huge amount of money at stake. But I'm prolonging, and Elliot, I know, wants to come in, so Elliot.
So the main point I wanted to make was around the general introduction of it, is that I think there's nothing wrong with seeing things as a citizenship like benefit, a positive thing of citizenship. We already have a recourse to public funds kind of regime in place. So until you get to indefinite leave to remain, you're not generally eligible for benefits if you're a worker. So that's already in place. But I think we do need to be better on citizenship. I think we need to have reasons to be a citizen. I don't think we should see it as just a sort of, it enables us to vote or it enables us to have a passport. There's more than that. For a local one, I think the kind of system that we'd start to look at is seeing it as a trial or a pilot, at which point you recruit at the start. So, but I think there is a way that you can grow it into a regional system as well, and that's done for tax in the US, for example. But I take your point about it is a challenge for creating incentives about residents if you do it as just on a regional basis. That really does need to be addressed.
So the importance of citizenship I agree with as a Conservative, but what I notice is that many of my dearly beloved progressive colleagues don't see the world that way, and they're the people who seem to advocate this. So I'm curious in my own mind how they see drawing that line. But perhaps we'll have that discussion amongst ourselves afterwards. Thank you, Chair.
We are moving on to the next question. We're skipping one, so over to you, Assembly Member Polanski.
Not to answer Assembly Member Garrett, no, I don't. I felt quite pointed. Will, if I can come to you. We've had well-rehearsed arguments nationally about winter fuel payments and indeed in London Assembly about free school meals, so about the concept of universality. And some of my less progressive colleagues, if I can put it like that, might say this is welfare for the rich. What would you say to that? Sorry, Will, I threw that at you if you caught that.
That was me, sorry. I think I caught that. But basically you're saying if, for example, basic income goes to everyone, then it's not just giving money to the rich. Is that the question?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so I mean, I think Elliot was already alluding to this at the start of the discussion, and so I'll be very quick. This benefit is, or this is an income floor, goes to everyone. The principle of that kind of universality or quasi-universality, residence-based universality, that principle is incredibly important, particularly politically in terms of saying, look, everyone has a right to this basic kind of floor, and so it's important that it's not simply targeted. We've seen what happens when you target benefits, very stigmatized. They get absolutely attacked for scroungers, skivers, etc., etc. We know that's not true. So universality is really, really important. Now, that's the first point. The second point is that, as Elliot was saying, the tax and benefit systems are incredibly intertwined, right? The way we pay for this and the way that most models which are robust and are not just simply borrowing or some kind of MMT scheme, for example, most schemes are about rejigging the tax system. Now, the Reed and Lansley models, the first introduction model is a what they call a cost neutral. There's no extra money coming in. It's rebalancing of tax bands. If you start talking about wealth taxes on 2% on assets over 10 million and so on, you can start funding it that way. Now, that means that the rich, the very richest, will be paying for this. So they'll be receiving the benefit. That's really important, but they'll also be paying for it kind of at the back end. So that's the fundamental principle of it. So it's not welfare for the rich. It's actually the rich making sure that everyone has a leg to stand on, reducing crime, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's the fundamental principle.
Thanks, Will. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Now, we are going to move on to a really important question from Assembly Member Clark. We've recently visited a group of wonderful people in a local community centre in Finchley, the Grange Big Local UBI experiment. I think Elliot knows a little bit about that. But this is quite an important question. So Assembly Member Clark's going to use up most of this time to talk to all of you about a trial, and we'd really like to get those opinions across that will inform us in our decision on our going forward for our report. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, thank you for that. So I'm asking this of both panels, so both of you and also the following panel who are UBI skeptics. So I think importantly, like if would it be beneficial to carry out a small-scale trial of UBI in London? And crucially, how many people would need to be involved in that trial? Would you be including both people in receipt of money and those that were described of those who would be paying for the trial? So what sorts of people would be included in that trial? How would it look? What would it look like? And should the mayor support such a trial of UBI in London? I think I will start with... Well, I'm going to let you self-select who starts, actually. Should we start with people in the room and then we'll go online? Does that work?
So I think what we're looking at as an idea is as a pilot. So the challenge with trying this on a small scale is that there are considerations that wouldn't be considerations for a full national policy. So we're looking at a pilot about how can you run a trial of this kind of system at a local level. And that's necessarily different in some ways to how it would be done in reality, but it's a really important starting point. So you start to see, could we reorganise some of the budgets from elsewhere that are currently spent on policing or health or social care, homelessness provision, all of those kinds of things that are downstream from income, but are hugely costly to the public purse and to people's well-being. So we produced, in consultation with people from Grange Big Local in East Finchley, with one attendant, Julia, attending today in the public gallery, to look at what local concerns were. And we based the development of the pilot on that, you know, alongside the need to get some robust evidence. Now, the challenge is that, you know, without central government funding, these things are tricky. We said we want to test a larger amount of income, so we matched the Welsh pilot in terms of £1,600 a month. If the Department for Work and Pensions says it won't be taken into account for things like universal credit calculations on an unearned basis, you can start to reduce those sums. Unfortunately, the current system says that if you receive unearned income, then you lose your universal credit one-to-one. But there is a benefit of it being unconditional. We said that we would start with a relatively small group. So it's sort of 15 to 30 people receiving it in a control group. You can have more with more funding, but that was a sort of practical starting point. Now, what you start to test out there is how the money's disseminated to them, how it's dispersed to them, how you have local support systems in place to ensure people don't have cliff edges and aren't without support. You start to test an evaluation system. Picking questions that are really effective and work in a local context are important, and it can ramp up to a much bigger trial. But that pilot, I think, is important to establish local concerns and context, albeit if more income comes in to fund it, there's a capacity to do something much bigger.
Before I move on to other panels, I think one really crucial thing you said was taking on local concerns. Apart from those in receipt, so how did you look at the concerns of those, so sort of the wider people, so people who would be paying in, so people who would be in what was described earlier as the people who would, you know, if it was universal, they would be in receipt of it, but then it would be taxed on the back end. So how were those concerns taken into account, or concerns around inflation, wider concerns? I mean, how did you take those into account when coming up with this trial idea?
So on the kind of larger points, we've done a lot of research separately to do this, to look into each of those features. And I haven't planned as well as Guy to have the books here, but we have a book out called Basic Income, The Policy That Changes Everything, which covers a lot of the things that we've discussed today. And it's in 50,000 words, so nice to get through quickly. The local challenges are different and were something that was a specific concern about this. So we ran discussions, consultations with local people in East Finchley and also in Jarrow in the northeast of England. And Grange Big Local were great in supporting that engagement. So those are what we looked at specifically there. And, you know, people do have general concerns about, oh, if suddenly we've got this money coming in, how does that affect relationships with neighbours who might find out, or, you know, these kinds of things. So there's a research purity thing, which is you have a saturation site, fully support, as Guy said. On the other hand, if you have a limited number of people, would you pick at random to make sure that people have a chance of participating and aren't going to be sort of like, singled out in a neighbourhood where it's a bit more prominent? So those are the considerations. It's about pragmatism versus the research purity.
see. Okay, Guy.
Yeah, thank you. You're listening to somebody who has the only experience of actually conducting basic income pilots. For my pains, I've probably got a lot of scars and the rest of it for that over years. And we did one in England, which I thought was going to be a flop. It was made into a TV series, which turned out, every case turned out to be a success. But I did say at the beginning there was a weakness of will issue. And I've just been involved in the Wales one as a technical advisor. And I've done pilots elsewhere. What I think is important if you do a pilot in London is that it should be for a community, in the sense that every individual of every household in that community should be the recipient, whether it's a smaller amount for children, but each woman and each man should receive it individually. I'm afraid I apologize that you have an all-male panel this morning, because what we've found in our pilots consistently is that women benefit more than men. It improves their status and their capacity and control of their lives in a big way, walking out of abusive relationships and so on. But I think it's important to say that you define the community at the beginning and say that anybody who's been living in this community, in this household in effect, for at least the past 6 months, and as regard that this is their home, all right, they should be the recipient. For a pilot, unfortunately, you should exclude people who come into the household during the pilot, simply because you want to be seeing the effect on behavior and attitudes. And you should have a control community. You don't have to make it a randomized controlled trials methodology. I'm a skeptic on that, but we have done controlled trials. And I think then you have a similar community. Now, among the rules that one should respect, and I've written an article about different rules one should respect for, is that the scheme should be upscalable and replicable. Those are two critical things that you take into the definition, into the pilot, and that you should require the recipients, if you were doing it in the area you've mentioned, you would ask the recipients, don't do any media interviews during the course of the pilot. You want to keep it low key for as long as possible, because the possibility of outside interventions and muddying the water, as it were. And I think in that regard, and if there's a need for a publicity campaign, to inform people that this is a demonstration project, in effect. And I think that those are important rules. But I would emphasize, and this is what we recommended in 2019, it should be for a community, not a few randomly chosen individuals in different types of community, because then you get a lot of spoilage problem.
Okay, online, Otto, do you want to go ahead?
No, thank you. Conducting local experiments is, I think, very important, but it also faces severe problems that I want to highlight as well. So in some ways, we've done a lot of experiments over the years and decades all around the world. So in many ways, the data is already in. We kind of know what the results are often going to be. But I think it's true that there's going to be local circumstances that you can really tap onto. You always get like new data on the specific circumstances, because the circumstances really matter in the outcomes. At the same time, I think the worry that I have with local experiments and randomized control trials as a methodology, for example, and regional saturation studies as well, is that this sort of feeds into the idea that there's an activist sort of government technocratic sort of process where you are trying out, doing one policy this year, another policy next year, and that you are kind of targeting populations or subpopulations and seeing what happens to them. all of this goes completely diametrically opposed to the idea of UBI, which should be a permanent, large-scale structural floor that builds sort of a foundation for diverse, complex society in a long term. It doesn't, go up and down. It's not taken away from you next year. So all of this, this sort of the background. So this sort of background goal should be kept in mind once we're, experimenting with UBI, because we're not really experimenting with UBI. We're experimenting with cash transfer programs that have some elements of the sort of program that I think would have the potential benefits that it does. But that long-term program requires moving beyond the pilot paradigm ultimately. And while doing the pilot, you have to keep this in mind that you are kind of like partly also contributing to the problem, I hate to say, in the way that you are, that anybody who's doing pilots is like, just feeding into the technocratic mentality that I think is one of the biggest dangers that poor people face today. And therefore, if used well, they can yield good data. They can be a platform for pioneering, generating political support, generating a bit new data. But they also have these dangers that I worry about. Thank you.
Thanks, Otto. Just to come in, I mean, I think those considerations are important. And thanks, Elliot, for bringing up that pilot, the East Finchley pilot design. I work for an organisation called Autonomy, and we worked with Elliot and other researchers to help design that pilot. Sadly, it didn't get the funds to kind of get off the ground. I think it's important for me to mention that. So Autonomy are working with Camden Council on a project which is scoping a basic income pilot in the borough of Camden. So there is a live scoping exercise going on with a borough around a basic income for a particular cohort. Now, Camden in 2024 recognised care experienced individuals as a protected characteristic. In support of this commitment, the council has initiated a scoping process, which Autonomy are the consultant on. I'm the project lead on, to explore the feasibility and design of a basic income pilot for care experienced young people in Camden. So this is something which is involved a number of phases. We've already been consulting the kind of internal Camden teams, service delivery. We've talked to care experienced young people themselves, run a bunch of engagements around that. We're just at a phase now where we're assembling an expert panel. And we'll be looking to design a pilot with a launch event of the final report of this scope in October. So this is something which we'd obviously be keen to discuss with the London Assembly at some point. This will need funding. There's no external funding yet for this, for any kind of pilot, should that be the conclusion of this scoping phase. So there is a London basic income pilot in scope, i.e. being designed. What would that look like, and particularly for care experience cohorts? So happy to discuss more, perhaps maybe not in the remaining 10 minutes, but yes, that's something which is underway.
So none of you answered my final question, which was, should the mayor support a small-scale UBI trial? It sounds like I've got a mixed range of answers, actually, from all of you. I think one interesting thing, particularly Otto said, I thought, not to put words in your mouth, but I thought what was interesting about what you said is sort of the scale of it, and actually that something that looked more like cash transfers is less likely to be sort of as effective in terms of research. But is that you think modelling is perhaps better than a small-scale trial? Is that what you were saying, or did I get that wrong?
Well, I wouldn't want to say that that I would be against experimentation. I just want to highlight that a lot of times people say something, people reach the wrong conclusions, or people sort of like carry the wrong sort of assumptions and expectations for these trials. So just as long as we keep the expectations in check and we sort of almost remind ourselves of what we're doing, it falls far short of the sort of like UBI vision as a sort of long-term project, then I think that's perfectly fine. And you can build up these smaller experiments into large scale, large scale models and large scale support and all that stuff. And to that extent, I'm all in favor of just keeping kind of the expectations in check.
Yeah, sorry if I didn't make it clear. I think it would be a fantastic initiative for the mayor to launch a basic income pilot. A point that I didn't make, which I should have done, is that you can learn a lot about how to introduce a basic income through pilots. It's not just the results and behavior and attitude. You can learn how to do it, and what would be needed to make optimal outcomes. What what sort of policies, whether it's advisory policies or some sort of institutional change, be it on the housing side or whatever. So I think you can learn a lot. We've now, I've got this dossier in front of me, we've got over 100 pilots and experiments, but many of them are not pilots because they're more experiments. A pilot is what I've just described. They're often for homeless or for ex-convicts or for the care home leavers like we've just done in Wales. I hope that the Mayor would favour a community approach, because I think you can learn a lot about the dynamics of it. And even if it is short term, as most pilots are, you can still see impact effects and legacy effects. We've measured legacy effects. And that leads to my last point, which is if the Mayor goes ahead and does a pilot, please build in a proper evaluation programme. And that includes a lot of time spent designing the evaluation instruments. Yeah. Really thorough. It took us over a year to prepare the instruments that we've used in our pilots. And I think probably we should have used more time. At least that's available now. But I do urge that the process should be really thoroughly prepared.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm just going to ask one last question to Elliot very quickly. Sorry? Sorry about that. Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, has been very, very vocal in his support. And if that was the approach that the Mayor of London had, would that be a step forward, do you think? Just very quickly.
Yes, so I think we have a context now where there are welfare reforms going in the opposite direction. And the Mayor has come out with criticism of it. And I think that's a really important starting point. However, there are some areas that are within his control that he can start to demonstrate that there is an alternative, that there is a different approach that could be pursued. Now, there are all of these challenges with doing that in a local area that you wouldn't have were it introduced at a national level. But to show that it can work and the benefits of it on a small level are really important. I think we're at a point now where there are several years until the next election. Parties need to show the impact that they're having. Our research shows that people in a number of constituencies where people have a higher risk of destitution don't believe that government can do anything. So what's a big way that you can challenge that? Use the time that you're in power to make real change in people's lives. What better way of doing that than to say we can directly increase income to ensure that you have better outcomes? So very, very much in favour of being more vocal on that.
Thank you so much. Now, you've been all fantastic guests, and thank you so much for all your responses. Guy, coming all the way from Geneva this morning, I really appreciate you coming here to the Chamber. That's a real effort from you, so I'm so grateful. We are going to take a very short adjournment now for 5 minutes. Thank you very much. Welcome back to today's Economy, Culture and Skills Committee meeting, where we will continue our discussion on universal basic income in London. I would now like to welcome our guest for the second panel, Anna Coote, who is the Principal Fellow New Economics from New Economics Foundation, Professor David Piachaud, who is the Professor of Social Policy at London School of Economics, and Dr. Matthew Thompson, who is the Lecturer in Urban Studies, University College London, University of London. We are expecting another guest, Dr. Joe Crisp from the Institute of Policy Research, University of Bath. We are going to move on to our first question from me, and this is to Joe and not Joe, he's not here, to David. We'll start with you, David, if that's okay. How effective would a UBI, Universal Basic Income, be at tackling inequality and poverty in London, particularly in work poverty, and who would benefit from a Universal Basic Income?
Thank you. To be honest, my answer is not at all. I've been studied tackling poverty and social security and other social services which are crucial to a sense of social security in society. But I would put UBI and some of its advocates about on the same scale as those who discuss mining for cryptocurrencies. Improvements in social security seem to me quite essential, and some of those in trying to reduce poverty are fairly clear what needs to be done, if there's a preference for that over having fighters with nuclear warheads. And the problem with UBI, which a lot of people sincerely think it will achieve something, but is that they draw on particular groups, small-scale studies, which for which the social security system does not work well. But in general, the social security system has made a huge impact on the extent of poverty, and it's only when it got cut back drastically with things like the two-child limit introduced by George Osborne and Ian Duncan Smith that poverty among children, the families with children, started to rise. I can explain why I don't think it makes any sense to conceive of it as a general system that would improve anything, would tackle the problem of nearly 1 million young people without any employment, education or training. I can talk about the injustice of it, frankly, as a generalised system, but to have a system targeted at London, a city, which would I mean, the word universal is tossed around rather like Universal Film Studios, which only existed in New York and Hollywood, which no doubt appeals to the American president. But it's to say it's non-means tested is in that sense it's universal. But to be able to tack that on to a very extensive social security system, which even the maniac Musk, I'm sorry, I'm using a lot of American analogies, but he didn't touch the social security system in America, which has carried on remarkably stably for a long time, since the 1930s. To think about replacing it or thinking about it as an adjunct on top of the overall social security system and the overall system of social services, because I think, and Anna Coote can talk much more about this, but thinking about income and not thinking about basic services on which a genuine sense of social security depends, it makes no sense at all. One has to, I think, look at them all in the round. So the basic answer to your question, I think, is no. I don't think it would contribute to improving social conditions in London.
Thank you so much. I think that was a very clear answer. Thank you. We're going to move on to the next question. We're missing one. So over to you, Assembly Member Polanski.
Thank you. Anna, if I can come to you. In recent years, UBI has increasingly been invoked as a solution to job losses caused by AI and automation. To what extent do you agree with this?
Well, there are many other ways of dealing with the problems for paid labour that are presented by automation and technology-induced unemployment, which will include things like a shorter working week, which is a very different kind of approach. I mean, I think UBI, or basic income, is a really, it's a false promise and actually a political con, because it doesn't, well, there have been, as Guy Standing was saying, and I listened to most of the last session, 101 field experiments across the world, all of which showed that the recipients were jolly pleased to get the money, by and large, and there were no sort of massively negative feedback, but all of them that had any sensible evaluation said this cannot be sustained as a way of ensuring that you improve people's well-being unless you have services as well. None of them has led to a scaled-up national programme. And you've got to ask yourself why. I mean, why do we need another experiment in London if you've already got all this knowledge from all these other field experiments, all of which have been partial, have been using small amounts of money for selected groups, and haven't gone anywhere in the end? I mean, the only exception being Alaska, and Alaska relies on income from fossil fuels. And is that what we want? So I agree with an awful lot of the feelings and the intentions and the will behind the case for universal basic income, but it's a false promise. So what you need to do, and this is where I'm coming from, is you need to be thinking about how can you meet people's needs universally within planetary boundaries. And you can only do that collectively, because markets have manifestly failed to do that. And that requires an approach that's very different, and that's where universal basic services come in. Now, I know you're not here to talk about that, but I would say that if you go down the UBI road, you simply suck up money, and if you were to do it in an adequate way, immense, sort of eye-watering sums of money that either aren't there, or if they are there, they can be used to have better housing, better transport, better childcare, better education, better parks, better libraries, all the things that the GLA could do. And I mean, I think there are sort of two questions here, really. Is UBI a good thing? No. Should it be a pilot in London? Is it something London can do? And I just don't see that the GLA can. Because if you're going to claw back the expense, the cost of any kind of UBI scheme, how would you get it back through taxes? Because you're not a tax-raising authority. And if you were and you could raise that money, would you really want to spend it on this complicated, minimal, inadequate payment to individuals that simply puts money into the marketplace, instead of thinking about, well, what is it that Londoners need? And Guy Standing was quite wrong to say, he might say he doesn't know what people need. There's masses of evidence about what human needs are. It's always backed up by, academic research, by public opinion polls, by consultations. People do know what they need. And a lot of what they need requires services, collectively provided measures that you can do, rather than simply saying, here's some money, go and spend it in the marketplace. Which isn't to say, and I'll stop here, we'll come back to this, that it's not important for people to have spending money. Of course it is. But the more you have decent services, actually the less spending money you require. You just think about childcare for a start, or housing. So I'll stop there.
Can I just respond with some things that were said in the last panel and also on our site visit? So you said that, of course, if you give people money, then they're going to be happy about it. But I think that's the whole point behind UBI, is that poverty is not a lack of character, it's a lack of resource and money. And so that's to give people the opportunity. Howard Reid's report shows that you could make it cost neutral. So it's not that you need to take this money from somewhere. It's a case of reforming the welfare system. So what I'm really interested in is my question. Is David said, I think I'm paraphrasing, but correct me, David, if I'm misrepresenting you, is that the welfare system used to be fine. It's been tinkered around with and now doesn't work. I would fundamentally disagree with that. I don't think it's ever been okay. It's just to see what's your position on kind of the current welfare system?
Well, on the current welfare system, it's clearly a very damaged system. But if you wanted to give everyone a universal basic income, and it was a cost-neutral measure, I mean, I know Howard's work, it would be a small amount. You would still need to have top-ups for all sorts of different things, for children, for where you live, for disability and so on. So you still have a complicated system that would have to assess people's needs and give people additional money. So, and if you had that money, which you could get from various tax reforms, which I think is what Howard is talking about, to make it so-called cost neutral, is that the best way to spend the money? Now, if you think instead about something like a guaranteed minimum income, and actually I think if you scratch the surface, this is where someone like Will is coming from. So you want everyone to not fall below a certain basic minimum level of income. Now we're talking about cash here. If you want to make sure that happens, you've got a different kind of reform that you can introduce. So a basic minimum income takes account of the fact people have earnings, they have, so if you can't earn, or you can't earn enough, then there may be a case for having a social security form. David may disagree with me about this, and I'm not an expert on this, but I think it's a much more sensible way to go, to think in terms of a basic minimum income or a guaranteed minimum income. It's much more affordable, and it goes alongside the provision of services that meet people's basic needs. I mean, if we all had to pay for our education, our healthcare, our childcare, our housing, our transport's a particular case in London, at a kind of market-based level, then how much would we need for our income? So we've got to think, one of the big mistakes I think is made often by people who think about poverty is that they only think about money. And this is changing now, and I'm glad to see that there are moves afoot to get the people who work on minimum income standards to take account of the value of public services and other collective measures that enable people to live well as part of what contributes to decent living standards. So I don't know.
So finally, I guess Guy's argument, or the panel's argument, in reverse to that, would have been this paternal and maternal argument. And I think from what I understood, Will was saying, was that it shouldn't be UBI versus universal basic services. Now it sounds, and I think your position is very pro universal basic services, but that's not necessarily an anti-universal basic income position.
Well, it depends what you mean by universal basic income. Okay. If by universal basic income you're really talking about a guaranteed minimum income, for example, that would be much more affordable, you can do that together. If you see, it's a really slippery term, isn't it? So Guy's saying it's not universal, it's basic. Okay, so you're not going to pay everyone. Who do you pay? Who do you leave out? And you questioned him in an interesting way about that. So I think it's incompatible if universal basic income means what its protagonists have always claimed that it means, and even people like Will and Guy was sitting here, and Guy was saying earlier that it's, even if you can only pay a little bit to start with, somehow they think they're on a journey towards the point where you can give everyone an adequate income to live on, then it wipes out the whole of the public sector. It wipes out all the money you would need to run decent public services. I did some, there have been plenty of, I'm not an economist, right? I'm a social policy expert. But if you think about, if you just gave every London adult, forget the children, there are about 6.6 million adults in London, you just gave them 50 quid a week. So then you would get some, basic, that would cost somewhere quite a long way north of 17 billion, right? Now that wouldn't be cost neutral. So, but if you got that money, say magically, you managed to raise it through taxes, or I don't know what you did, would you really want to use it for that money? Or would you think, well, maybe we could have better childcare, maybe we could do better housing, maybe we could give everyone a free travel pass? All the other ways in which you can transform people's lives and give them a sense of fairness and security. I think it's you have to see it as a package. You cannot look at income independently of services.
I'm not here to give evidence, but I think they would agree with you on that. Cost neutral isn't about just giving them money and not changing anything else. It's about changing the system holistically, including the universal credit system. Thank you, Chair.
Interesting. Assembly Member Georgie.
I think bringing it back to the point of welfare. David, I feel like I'm going to get a more exciting answer from you given your remarks about American politics. And Anna, please feel free to jump in. This whole point about, replacing the welfare system. So, Anna, back to your point on the cost of this. So back of the fag packet maths, if you gave every man, woman and child £1,000 a month, which I think is, probably what you need if we were to replace welfare at the very least, you're looking at £840 billion a year. The current welfare bill is about £240 billion. So we're talking about 31% of GDP just on UBI if you were to go for probably what the upper end of what could be offered. So, but then again, what I've heard so far from you and David is more high-spending welfareism into a broken system. So, therefore, is there not some middle road, if I were to be generous to the UBI advocates, between what you're saying and what they're saying? Just playing devil's advocate. It could be either of you.
Sorry.
Apologies, Matthew, as well.
Yes.
I mean, please feel.
Yes,
I'm really
you.
sorry. I've just tunnel vision there.
Well, yeah. I mean, thanks for the invite, and I guess I think there can be a middle ground. I suppose thinking about UBI with a UBS or with a welfare state that's reformed. I'm kind of interested in the regeneration. So I teach town planners and sort of real estate students in UCL, and very much interested in urban regeneration, housing, and how housing markets intersect with labour markets and so on, spatially. So if UBI were targeted in the kind of pilot that we've been talking about, say in East Finchley, but on a much larger scale, the sort of thing that Guy was talking about earlier, where there's a concentration and density, and it actually genuinely is universal at that scale, at least. I mean, universality is obviously relative always, because it's always a nation state, which is not universal. It's not the world, is it? So universal at a particular neighbourhood scale, we might start to see some middle ground in terms of money circulating locally. You can start to think about conditionalities placed on the way that money might move. It might then create multiplier effects through local economies, it's small businesses, and support jobs and welfare in ways. But I agree with Anna on this broadly, that services are really important, and that's the floor that we really need. But why not try something like injecting money into a local economy that really needs it? So I think that's where it's interesting for me. It's where it starts to play into that kind of real conundrum, that problem of spatially kind of concentrated poverty, and how to solve that. We've tried lots of things over the decades, and we haven't tried this. So I think give it a go. Why not? I mean, there isn't any evidence yet on this. As we've heard, a lot of the pilots are piecemeal. They target particular segments of the population. They don't do the whole community of that particular place. And we don't really know what the kind of multipliers will look like, what the spillover and the kind of interactional effects would be like if that were to happen.
Can I just take issue with what both questions have mentioned, the system being broken, and I to be honest, I find that a really unhelpful remark. Now, you may say I was at LSE a very long time, and with connections with Crossman and Barbara Castle and Titmuss and Abel Smith that I'm got vested interest in. But I'm not saying the system is. It's not remotely perfect. It's got some terrible problems. The extent of child poverty and the NEETs are two I would focus on. But to say it's broken and therefore we sort of throw the whole thing in the scrap heap seems to be completely wrong. If you simulate, as I once did, taking away the existing system, then poverty just shoots up. It's not surprising. I mean, families with children have less, old age pensioners have less, people who are disabled have less. So you just, if you say the system's wrecked and so let's scrap it, then you would create vastly worse problems. And I don't think you politically would get very far, because if you look at the resistance to taking away old people's fuels allowances, that here you'd be taking away the whole of their national insurance and so forth. I think Martin Wolf, in his book on the crisis of democratic capitalism, summed it up very well. In the end, the UBI is too ill-targeted to be a good use of the additional tax money that would have to be raised to pay for it. That is, in the last resort, all there is to say about the idea. Now, if you're talking about particular groups and problems of young people leaving care, or people being discharged from prison who have no skills, who have very little have had for many years no control over their lives at all, then thinking about income, thinking about services that can support them is crucial. Just to correct one thing, I'm an emeritus professor, but I like teaching, so I go and tutor in Feltham Young Offenders Institute, and the problems of those people coming out are just horrific. I mean, it's amazing the recidivism rate isn't far higher. But so there are real problems about money, services, support services, problems of parenting and obesity and access, command over resources. I think one thing that's worth remembering is that the origins of UBI are actually very much the same as the origins of in America of negative income taxes pursued by Milton Friedman, and because he rejected public services more or less as a whole, and so he said, give poor people some money, providing they were American. He wasn't, although he came from a migrant family, he was not keen on migrants, as seems to be common in Republican circles.
Yeah, I'm just conscious of time, but no, and I we'll debate Milton Friedman after this meeting, I'm sure. But I think you've made very clear what your views are with regard to my particular question on the cost of UBI, and your views on the current welfare state. And Anna, just if you wanted to briefly come in. No, it was a very good contribution. Thank you. And Anna, just on that.
Well, I agree with David that the system isn't broken. I said it was damaged, and it's damaged because it's been cut away. And one of the reasons why there's so much strain on the cash transfer dimension of the welfare state is because of the way that public services and local facilities have been eroded by public spending cuts. So people have nowhere to go. There are no libraries. The parks are in a state. The housing and childcare and social care and all these things cost a huge amount of money, and so people haven't got enough money to live on, and there's more strain on the cash transfer system because of that, as well as because of the things that, like, the two-child cap on child benefit. I'm a great believer in child benefit, and in a way, child benefit's a kind of UBI for children. Great, let's have it. Let's have it back. Let's get rid of the two-child cap. That works. I also have no problem at all with the scheme that they trialled in Wales with the care leavers. Great. It's a select group of people for a limited period of time, and you can understand it, you can see how it is affordable, and that's fine. That's not UBI. UBI is giving everybody the same money, preferably enough money for them to live on, unconditionally, and it's generally, and by a lot of its protagonists see it as an alternative, as you said, to the wider welfare state, which includes public services. And, I mean, no wonder it is a big favourite among the tycoons in Silicon Valley, because it just puts money out into the system. It does nothing to change the underlying structures that cause poverty and inequality, whereas more and better public services create jobs. They create jobs everywhere, in all locations, because you need the services close to you. They are generally good jobs, and they're very often green jobs because they rely on relationships, not on hardware. So there are all sorts of, I mean, I could go on about this, but there are all sorts of integral benefits to more and better public services to meet people's needs than this sort of approach to just giving everybody a bit of money, a little bit of money.
Okay. Sorry, Chair. Thank you very much. I didn't think it'd be possible. I'd be more wound up by what I've just heard here than I did in the first panel, but I'm eager to come back to it later on. Thank you. I'll leave it to you, Chair.
Assembly Member Polanski.
Yeah, can I briefly understand, Anna, if, suppose a thought experiment, there was a way of doing a basic income where anyone who is living in poverty, and particularly someone who is disabled and living in poverty, was better off as a result of basic income than they are under the current welfare system. What I'm hearing is you wouldn't necessarily have a problem with basic income. Your problem with it is your concerns, which I would also share, that people in poverty would be worse off. But if there was a way of designing it which made sure that essentially the only people who are worse off were the wealthiest in society, and all I mean by worse off is because they're paying more in tax, but actually you could argue they're also benefiting because a more equal society, to refer to Assembly Member Giorgio's numbers before, you're saving money. You're saving money from the National Health Service in terms of health. You're saving money in terms of your public services because people who are living in poverty are then able to prevent needing to use some of these services because they're able to spend their money in more effective ways.
You can't have that. You're saying give more to the disabled, improve their incomes. I'm not going to argue with that. But you're saying, well, we won't give that to everyone in society. The whole point is that you give it to everyone and you recover it in tax. And if you give what is given to some of the most disabled people to everyone, you're talking about raising, doubling public expenditure.
Can I clarify for you, David, just so you're discussing a point I've made? So if you're disabled, you would still receive your disability benefit in addition to the basic income that everyone else receives. So what I'm trying to counter here is the idea that someone who's living in poverty or disabled would be worse off under a basic income, because as far as I understand, every proponent of basic income says there needs to be a better off mechanism, which means that those people who are suffering the most from a very unjust society are better off as a result of basic income, because fundamentally you're looking to tackle poverty and injustice.
They will only be better off if they have housing they can afford, and it's good quality housing. If they have childcare they can afford, that's good quality childcare. If they can get around where they need to go to public services and education. If the schools aren't damaged. If the healthcare system is in a reasonable state, and I'm not just talking about the NHS, I'm talking about public health systems. So it's not one or the other.
Agreed, and then they'll stop, otherwise the chair will tell me off. But the mayor can't control a lot of those things. What the mayor could do is a pilot to make sure that we're building the evidence and the case for a national basic income, as well as improving public services. I don't think anyone here wouldn't want to see, well, I don't think anyone here would want to see public services not improve.
But that's not an add-on, Zach. That is essential. It isn't just something you do, oh yeah, of course it'll happen, we're all in favour of it. That's what they all say, all these protagonists of UBI. Oh yes, of course we want public services, but they don't think about the trade-offs. If you're going to pay for one thing, i.e. this massive expenditure on UBI, you're not going to have the money for all the other things that make life better and bearable and worthwhile for people to live and flourish. So it isn't, that's not it's not a reasonable way to think about it. You've got to think of it all as a package.
I think it's the affordability point where we disagree, but I'll stop because otherwise the chair will.
Are you sure? This is your last moment, remember? So if
no,
there's
I'll
anything
leave it.
else that you need to...
No,
okay.
that's okay. Well, there's the phrase that anything we can do, we can afford. And I think of the cases, how do you tax or where do you get that money from? But that's not a London-based issue, so I will move on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Assembly Member Platsky. Assembly Member Clark.
Thank you. Matthew, I'm going to come to you because we've not heard quite enough from you yet. Just in terms of administration challenges associated with UBI, I mean, I think Anna has made so many, actually Anna and David have both made so many good points, but if you were to have UBI, could you set out what the challenges would be around administration of UBI?
Well, what a question. I guess with the caveat that my expertise on UBI, I came to it as a postdoctoral research fellow at the Heseltine Institute when the Liberal Democrats, a task force, approached us to ask us to do a review, which is maybe how you picked me up. So I did a review of the evidence for the first time when I've actually looked into what UBI really amounted to and got a general sense of, and produced a report for the task force, right? And got a general sense of what was out there. So that, with that caveat in mind, so my expertise is more spatial, local, thinking about the way that money might work locally. But with that in mind, I think the administrative difficulties are in identifying, because the UBI, as we've discovered so far, is tricky on that universal aspect, who to include and how. And the most difficult people to find are also those that need it most. So people outside of the tax benefit system, people perhaps with citizenship rights that are kind of slightly more fuzzy, refugees, people waiting for asylum claims, people who've fallen through the net, homeless people. And so how would you actually... The administrative task of actually getting hold of those people, identifying them, could be fairly high and burdensome. But I mean, it can be simply solved just by putting out a call. If this is very speculative, right? This is like imagining across if the politics are there, putting out a call and people would sign up. And then that would be a way to, because people would obviously sign up for free money. And we've talked a bit in the previous panel about the difficulties of that, I guess. That's one difficulty. Yeah, I mean, we've talked a lot about the tax benefit kind of like calculations that would be required. There's this thing, the trilemma is the thing that's often talked about. We've got adequacy, affordability, but also advantage, and advantage being simplicity, administrative simplicity. So, if disability benefit is being paid as well, which it should be, then the simplicity aspect starts to shake. So a lot of UBI researchers do really point to that trilemma between those three poles. You can have two, but you can't have three, maybe, and that's all. That's based on assuming the politics stack up for it. And you get a split across the spectrum, the political spectrum. Some on the right or the left would go for one of those poles in different ways. So to get everyone on side as a coalition to support it is pretty tricky, which is why the national conversation is much more difficult and needs this kind of evidence. So a pilot in London that is concentrated and actually targeted at a certain kind of outcome and then monitored and evaluated would be an interesting thing to do in terms of building that evidence base to start to build that coalition.
Sorry, microphone issues. It comes to us all. I suppose, though, the question then, and we'll come to this question later, but just when you're talking about a trial, I think what's interesting, though, is what you say, people will always sign up for free money, and I think that's true. But then if the trial isn't wider to those also paying in or those who are going to have perhaps less good public services, and how is that trialed on a smaller basis? And I'm going to come to that question later, so I'll leave it there, but I will ask you that question later. Just on the point about being hired by the Liberal Democrats, so I'm curious about this because they were obviously pro-UBI and have now changed. And I think what's interesting is to have a major political party abandon their support for UBI. I think, what do you think that suggests in terms of achievability or political popularity of it?
Well, I must have written a very critical report for them to have abandoned it in 2020. I mean, it was during lockdown, so, as an independent university institute, we were sort of commissioned, I guess. And there was interest at that time because there was the talk of emergency cash injections, and we saw what happened. Yeah, I don't know. I guess what does it say about the politics of it? Well, there have always been throughout history these surges and declines in interest in UBI, depending on the crisis moments. And I mean, I can't speak for the Liberal Democrats where they've moved politically, but it's interesting to note that the Labour Party has also flirted with this off and on. Obviously, it conflicts very slightly, as Anna has suggested, with the idea of a beverage in welfare state. But it's not that conflictual. It's just a different means. There's a different means of doing something around supporting people.
But it is hugely different, because instead of saying we will collectively introduce measures, public services and other collective measures through our democratically elected institutions to meet people's needs, we will simply give everyone a sum of money to spend in the marketplace. That is hugely different.
Thank you. As the only Lib Dem here, I just want to ask an additional question on that, because as I'm going to take my chair hat off slightly. There was a commitment to universal basic income from a lot of members because of the liberal values of universal basic income, and the move towards the guaranteed basic income has now been proposed. Can you just give us an explanation of the differences between a universal basic income and a guaranteed basic income that has been now proposed by the party?
I don't actually know. What is a guaranteed basic income something to do with the income you receive through work and not through the state? Yeah, so it wouldn't cover everyone directly. I think this does relate to a point that Anna's been bringing up around residual income, right? So, I don't mean to suggest that UBI and UBS, for instance, are exactly the same thing, nor a guaranteed minimum income or UBI the same thing. They all have different emphases on being in work or out of work, on the role of the state in kind of regulating this stuff. And I think a UBI unregulated, without controls and checks and balances, would be a disaster, because it would effectively just move money into the hands of those that can suck it up out of the marketplace. At the moment, Silicon Valley, Amazon. How would you possibly prevent the kind of siphoning off of monetary circuits of value from a particular locality when people are shopping on Amazon that's in tax havens, right? So that on that basis, it is pretty tricky. And I'm not suggesting you just do a UBI across the board without any kind of investment in conditionalities, public services, and so on. With guaranteed minimum income, the fact that then introduces another condition for people, which is to be in work, is a problem, right? When we're facing threats of unemployment, technological unemployment, how would that possibly address the kind of universality aspect of UBI? It's a tricky one, unless again, and then it introduces the same problems of like, well, how do you support those out of work? I've been playing a bit of devil's advocate today, partly because I feel there's a lot of critical energy against UBI on the panel, but I do agree with Anna on a lot of this in terms of thinking about, we need to think about the foundational economy, right? So, if there's the things in life that support us and that are foundational to societal functioning and individual flourishing, and we've mentioned a lot of these: housing, transport, food, even digital data access to, education, health, obviously, those things are really so important. And it's a case of, in all these different debates, how do we make those work for people, and how do they have democratic ownership over those things too, right? And I think it comes down to the politics of an individual case. So how do we get those things working for people? And UBI won't always do that. Of course it won't. UBS is much more likely to do that. But does it have to be an either or? I don't know. I don't think. I mean, I get the sense that here in London there's a chance, an opportunity to try out something around a pilot for UBI, which is obviously something that should be, I think, jumped on.
That evidence approach, I think, is what you're advocating here. Am I right? Is that okay? Assembly Member Garrett.
If it's any consolation, the previous panel was much more in favour. The meeting was structured in that way. So I don't know whether you were in the public gallery earlier, but don't worry, there was no shortage of people saying that it's the best thing since sliced bread. I'm not sure if there's anything else to say on administration, which actually was my first question. I think we might have covered it, but I just wanted to clarify this trilemma I think you just referred to. So just to clarify a moment, so the three kind of poles of that, if you like, are affordability, effectiveness, and simplicity in the sense that it replaces everything else. And it seems to me that...
Well, affordability, adequacy, yes, so effectiveness being sufficient enough to support people, if
yes.
that's what you mean by effectiveness, yeah.
Yes. So on the assumption, I make the bold assumption that any policy that's not affordable is just dead in the water before you start, then that's one of the poles locked down. So that then that seems to me to leave you with a fundamental dilemma between either it being effective or it achieving what it says on the tin, which is replacing everything else. So it just seems to me that then because you can't not pin down affordable. You can't say, here's a plan that makes everything brilliant, and by the way, it costs an amount of money that is unfeasible. Sorry, actually, I'm going down the wrong road, because actually I just want to clarify them in my own mind, and those are the three. So it's whether you can afford it, whether it delivers sufficient cash to people to actually be worth doing, and whether it achieves the simplicity of replacing everything else. That's the trilemma you mentioned.
Yes, that's right,
okay.
yeah.
Okay, thank you. I don't think I have anything else on administration. So thinking about the labour market, perhaps I'll start with you, David. One of the questions I put to the panel earlier was about the impact that this might have on the labour market, and there are two that I can see, and I'm interested in your thoughts on them. One is around eligibility, so the point about not every single person who is in Britain. I don't want to get into the who's a citizen, who's got a right to work, who's got indefinite leave, who's just arrived 5 minutes ago on a dinghy. But clearly, not all of those people can be eligible to this. No one would think that. So there has to be a line somewhere, and so therefore, realistically, there'll be people in the London labour market who aren't eligible for this, and what impact that might have on effectively creating a two-tier labour market. And then the second concern, which I put to the previous panel, and they weren't interested. They didn't agree, but I'm interested in whether you agree. Whether it potentially allows employers to pay, in inverted commas, sub-market wages, because you're effectively subsidising people's income, so they're able to work for, in inverted commas, sub-market. So it becomes, in effect, a massive taxpayer subsidy to business. So I don't know whether those two impacts on the labour market, if we brought this in, everyone's looking very thoughtful. Who would like to go first? Matt?
I can answer that quickly. I think. I mean, it wouldn't. It would have no effect on the income, on the wages paid by big companies or small, because if it were that universal basic income that was actually distributed broadly enough, it would give people a bargaining power, and people would refuse to work. It would create other problems potentially, like, would those jobs last for long if they can't find people to work them? But effectively, there would be some kind of labour capital kind of balancing, and give people some power in negotiating workplace wages. I can't see them dropping. Not if
so
it
in
was
effect, you're saying the
generalised.
opposite. Sorry, so in effect, you're saying it'd be the opposite. It would give those people doing currently very low wage work, it would give them the opportunity just to walk away and say, I'm not going to do that for that wage, pay me more, or I don't need the money anymore.
That is a big, that's one of the main arguments for, I think, UBI, is that it would increase the bargaining power of labour, if broadly distributed, of course. And people can then do meaningful work, or they can do work, care in their community, care at home, self-care, education, whatever it is that they want to do, and that could lead to incredible benefits that spill out across society, in theory, but we just don't know, because there's nothing that's been trialled like this.
No, I agree with that. The trials don't quite fit the bill in terms of, what, they're not trials of quite the same thing. I do agree with that. David, did you have anything to add on that?
A lot of the literature on UBI haven't put it in terms of eligibility, but conditionality, and it's been at the other end of the scale, and debates about Malibu surfers. Should they be entitled to a universal basic income if they choose to surf all day? There are disagreements. I mean, Von Parish, who was sort of intellectual spur of the whole UBI idea, said that work-leisure choices were a matter of taste, of no concern to others. Therefore, an unconditional basic income is just. I mean, if people choose to say that pay is not adequate, however high it is, then they could still get the basic income. I think that's the misconception of work-leisure choices. For some people, leisure is going on holiday and gap years or whatever, and it's chosen leisure. But for most of the people concerned with social security now, it's unemployment or maybe pushed out of jobs because they're too old or unable to take jobs because of their health conditions, so that their leisure is you could say they have all this leisure time, but they would much rather be in work. And if there were support services, transport facilities that got them there, and adaptations and all sorts of things, then they don't want to be in leisure. They want to be working part of general society. So conditionality, to my mind, is just. That simply saying to any group of people, completely regardless of age, health, just on preference, I would like to be supported by the state at a minimum guaranteed level, is, to my mind, is untenable. I mean, if that were applied, it would be a very, very minimum. I mean, I don't want anyone to starve, but I wouldn't want. I don't think it would be just to support everyone at a decent standard of living, and therefore conditionality and rules, which are very, very difficult, as debates about PIPs and whatever that you could call PIPs are sort of UBI for certain conditions, and just like child benefit, I feel that's really just and very important. But to remove any conditions and say you're all eligible, just in terms of administration, I was just thinking, what about expats who don't want to pay tax in Britain? Are you going to say, well, you've got to pay tax, but we'll give you your UBI? But that's a thought.
So can I just? So that's quite interesting. But can I just try to? I don't want to put words in your mouth. So this is my understanding of what you just said. So yes or no? You earlier gave a kind of financial reason why it won't work, 'cause it's too expensive. But what you've just given, I think, is a philosophical reason why it would be a bad idea, in the sense that you're saying just indiscriminately paying people, regardless of what they do, is sort of philosophically a problem. Is that appreciative of what you just said? Is that fair?
I think that.
Okay, thank you. Anna, did you have anything on
labour
labour market?
I'd like to add to that a political reason why I think it's a bad idea. I mean, I agree with what David said, and that is that unlike more and better public services, UBI, in whatever guise, puts enormous, it's a single lever, puts enormous power in the hands of the state. And it turns citizens into dependents, sort of denizens, if you like, because can you imagine if we're all dependent on universal basic income, which the state gives us, several things would happen. For one thing, you could have a government comes in and says, we don't like that anymore, and just turn the tap off. And then you'd have lost all the other things that have since been... so we would go back to a sort of market-based or free-for-all, which would be terrible for poverty and inequality. So that's one thing. Then the other thing is that you get a citizenry or a denizenry, if you like, who are in thrall to the state because they depend absolutely on the government to keep that money coming in. And if they step out of line, then they'd be afraid of losing that money. And I don't think you should underestimate the enormous political power that it gives to government. If you compare it with services where power is much more diversified among different services, and you've got, workforces in the different service areas and so on. Yes, of course, we've seen how government can cut back on public services, but it's a different mechanism, very different, much harder to do, very easy for a government to just turn the tap off. And the third thing that can happen, and this comes to the point about simplicity, which terrifies me, actually. I'm just waiting for Nigel Farage to come out with a proposal for UBI. And it will be popular if we don't find ways of explaining, and he would only do it by he'd probably cut grants to local councils, grants to the GLA, grants to the NHS, grants to schools, and he'd be buying votes. It's a vote-buying mechanism, which is why I said right at the beginning I think it's a real con, and why it's so popular among people very rich people in the United States where they don't have a history of a welfare system like we have, and they just want the population to keep on shopping without disturbing their capacity to accumulate wealth. So those are worries that I have that are both philosophical and political, I suppose you could say.
Thank you. I mean, my question was about labour market, but I think perhaps that was answered at the beginning, and you went on. Funnily enough, you went on to what I was going to go on to ask, which was whether UBI would make London a fairer, a more equal place. So perhaps you don't. I feel like you've just answered that question. So if you want to add something to that, but I was going to add a rider, which was, again, another question that I asked to the previous panel. It seems to me, whenever you're talking about tax and benefits and so on, there's this question of incidence that economists talk about, where you deploy money here, but it possibly actually the benefit pops up somewhere else. And one obvious thing that might happen is you give a lot of money to people who often are in rented accommodation, and the money winds up through higher rents and therefore gets sucked up by landlords and not by the intended beneficiary. So if you wanted to make a comment on whether that's realistic, unrealistic, or just plain wrong, and any further comments on fairer or more equal, but I feel you might have covered that. Anna?
Just, one obvious candidate for cutting, if you were going to pay for a UBI, would be a housing benefit. Now imagine if you did that. So you cut housing benefit, you give everybody UBI, the poorest would suffer, wouldn't they? Because they're the ones who wouldn't get the housing benefit any longer. So it just, it doesn't add up. I mean, much better to spend that huge amount of money you'd need in order to put this up to scale, even just across London, huge amount of money, spend it on introducing more affordable housing.
I see some nodding. I don't know whether you... Okay, yep. Okay, officially noted as a nod. I don't have any... I mean, is the concern about the... Because what I got from the panel earlier when I asked the question about whether the incidence, in other words, you pay a lot of money to people and then it just ends up being absorbed in rent increases, the answers that I got were about, there was a mention of rent control, there was a mention of, so from one person and from another person who perhaps is politically on a different point said, actually what you do is you deregulate the housing market and have a massive increase in supply. And both of those seem to me to be an implied admission that that was a fair concern, that it would just turn into rents, but without quite saying so. So, but is that therefore a reasonable concern that without rent control, which I don't think is likely to happen, or a massive increase in housing supply, which...
As to your point, I'm afraid I disagree that it wouldn't encourage some employers to charge to pay lower wages. I think it would certainly encourage some landlords to charge higher rents. And that's the last thing you want in London, of all places, is to have something that pushes up rents that doesn't benefit the residents at all.
Okay. I don't see any other enthusiasm to come in. I think I'm done in that case. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. I must say, despite the fact that we have panels discussing slightly different perspectives, the one thing that Anna, you just said, it was amplified in the other panel, was about the rise of populism. I thought that was quite an interesting point to make. And if anything is coming out of this discussion is the need to deal with poverty, to deal with the welfare system that we have currently. And I really did appreciate those thoughts. Thank you very much. We are moving on to our most important question, which will really emphasise, kind of move forward for our recommendations to the Mayor of London, and we'd like to hear from all of the panel guests. Assembly Member Clark.
Thank you for that. I asked this of the previous panel, and your answers, I'm sure, will be quite different. This committee did visit the Big Grange Local in Finchley, where we heard from UBI supporters who wanted to do a trial of 15 people on the receiving end. Sorry, there's waving going. Is everything okay? Okay, yes. Okay. So the question is, would it be beneficial to carry out a small-scale trial of UBI in London? And if so, what would a trial look like? But finally, should the Mayor support a small-scale UBI trial? I'll start with you, Matthew.
All right, great. Thank you for that question. Yeah, yes, the Mayor should support a UBI trial, but would it? What does small scale mean? If it's only 15 people, if it's 15 people, it won't. We can always predict in advance what we're going to get. People's lives will improve, of course. Mental health will go down. Education and entertainment will go up, etc. But there's loads of studies that do this, that have found this already. It's a bit of a no-brainer. You give people money, money pays for things. They're going to spend it on things that make their lives better. But what does it mean in terms of the actual regeneration of a place? I think it would take a certain number of people to cross a threshold of density and participation and scale in a particular area, for then to start to see these multiplier effects emerge. And you know, if a pilot were to be piloted, so to speak, or designed in that kind of way, you start to track things like how that money circulates. You might use an LM3 multiplier tracker, the local multiplier 3, which the New Economics Foundation's pioneered, and the likes of the Centre for Local Economic Strategies have used in places like Preston to think about procurement spend. Once you start looking into those sorts of the granularity of the movement of this capital, you start to see maybe how the benefits might spill out beyond those 15, or in theory it should be something like 500, 1,000, or many thousands ideally, for it to really kind of get to those thresholds. And then you can start to see maybe how it then relates to things like regeneration, I think. But that is, I think, politically, it's obviously beyond the current situation. But thank you,
David.
Research on the impact of changes in behaviour seems to me very important, and one of the most important bits of research in Britain in relation to poverty seems to me looking at what Sure Start has achieved, and there's lots of programmes like extending free school meals and breakfasts at schools, which affect nutritional levels, which affect educational levels, but they're not a basic income. It's not just giving people money and seeing what happens. I mean, whether in some ways people who have more money are likely to feel better off, but they may spend it on anything. We don't. And if the concern is actually about the welfare of children, about people's conditions of living, then I don't think it's an effective way of studying that to give a few people 15 more money, because without asking the question, well, can we give the 15 people in the whole London area, 15 million people, that, and who would pay for that? And it seems to me the resources of that the London Assembly can influence are not on that order. So if you're experiment in terms of particular services and particular groups, and all well and good, but not just UBI because it's a nice idea.
I agree. Anna?
Obviously, I think it would be a really bad idea to do any kind of pilot unless you're absolutely certain you could scale it up afterwards. What would be the point? And if you could continue it, because what would happen to those people that you're giving the money to when you stopped? And what would you learn that you would add to the huge body of evidence that's already been gathered by countless field trials and experiments in UBI, all of which have shown that it can't be scaled up? So I'd say don't do it. Certainly don't do it without thinking about what the trade-offs are. If you have a budget for this, what would you spend it on otherwise? And to echo David, you could have really interesting experiments in London following what Camden Council have been doing, where you take a group of people and you say, what do you need? And they will say, we need things like transport or better housing. And you work with them to work out a bundle of collective measures that would improve their lives. Now, that would be something we haven't had before, and we would learn something from it. We've learned everything we could possibly know about UBI, that it's too expensive, it's unaffordable or inadequate, that it can't be scaled up, and it never has been, that it's always popular with people you give the money to until you stop. So we don't need to do that anymore. But yes, if you want to do a pilot with one of the councils that's, I think the other councils apart from Camden who are doing this, who are experimenting with, a bundle of collective measures to improve people's lives. And in everything I've said, I don't want to downplay the importance of people having enough money to live on. But that's not UBI. That could be a guaranteed minimum income. It could be simply an improved social security system building on what we already have, which is not impossible at all, especially if you start by bringing back the child benefit for every child be a good start. So, no, please don't do this. It would be so bad for you politically to do this, and then what happens in the end? Nothing. You've just spent a lot of money. It would just be really bad politics and really bad for the people who you're doing the trial with, and really bad for Londoners in general.
I think that's very clear. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
We've had a reaction from some Assembly members by that response. So should we go to Assembly Member Georgie first and then Assembly Member Polanski? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Matthew, I really struggled with your logic in your last comments, because effectively you say what you did say, which is, 15 people given free money, of course they're going to be happy. We don't need to do some intellectual exercise. I could go on the street and do that right now. Give everyone 100 quid. Oh, are you happy now? Of course I am. I couldn't afford 100 quid for every person that walks by. But that's the point. But then you go on to say, 500 to 1,000. But from everything we've heard, from the admonitions from David and Anna, on the fact that, it still doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't tell you inflationary effects, doesn't tell you the impacts on people's livelihood, doesn't tell you what unless you remove welfare, what the impacts on them would be on housing costs, blah, 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 blah. We've heard it all already. How then can you say there is any difference between a study of 15 and 500 to 1,000, given we've got a population of over 8 million in London, nearly 9 million? So can you just briefly outline how you came to that conclusion?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks for the invitation to clarify. It's basically, that's their figures plucked out of the air, but I'm just trying to gesture at the fact that there is a threshold within a particular locality that will be reached where that money starts to do more good for the locality and for wider businesses, entrepreneurship, local labour markets in ways that don't just affect those individuals. But just to give money to 15 individuals won't do much beyond those individuals, right? But there's a certain kind of threshold level of concentration, density. We get this in the economic geography we call these agglomeration effects. This is what structures most economic policy in most cities, right? Why not apply that to regeneration in a local area with UBI as one of the tools? So UBI starts to switch away from it being a kind of welfare type debate into something else. It's more about a spatially targeted regeneration policy that could have effects a lot on things like entrepreneurship, the starting up of social enterprises, community development trusts, whatever, that do all sorts of different kinds of work in a neighbourhood. But it would have to be linked to certain conditionalities, and you'd need participating anchor institutions like supermarkets, hospitals, schools, etc. The council would be a big player in this. And there are experiments around the world that have started to do this. So in Amsterdam, facing similar kinds of challenges as London, one of the deprived neighbourhoods is very close to issuing a not an alternative currency, a euro that's encrypted with certain conditions about how it can flow. And a community fund was set up, or was mooted to be set up. Politically, it never went anywhere, unfortunately. But some of that money would flow through an area, and after, if it left before, say, 6 months, there would be a fee charged to that exit. So it's a local currency. All right? There's lots of other conditions attached to this. But what they were going to do was they were going to issue a UBI, a basic income, to many hundreds of people living in that area, and issue it in that encrypted currency, in that encrypted euro. And then you start to see these multiplier effects through that economy in ways which would be incredibly beneficial for that locality, if not for those individual people as such, right?
But Matthew, I still don't get your logic, because why need a UBI trial when, and by the way, you mentioned councils. I don't trust any council with not many in London with my council tax money. I tell you that due to incompetent leadership in most London boroughs. But on your point, why do you therefore need to give people money to then go spend it in local shops or regen the area? Because that happens already. Well, you might as well just say, here, I know, where are we, Newham Council, just go give those local businesses some money. Why do you need UBI for that?
Well, isn't that artificially propping up local businesses?
Well, but that's effectively your line of argument, isn't it?
Well, we're artificially propping up places, I guess, slightly different. I mean, people then spend it freely on what they want to buy, which is a really important aspect of agency, right? there has to be interventions into markets somewhere. Admittedly, protectionism or kind of propping up in sort of state aid in some form or another is going to happen. If we're talking about industrial strategy or local economic development or regeneration of deprived places, there's going to have to be an intervention, which is going to be an intervention into a market, which is going to be protectionism or something. But yeah, I mean, I'm not suggesting we hand money to businesses. How can you pick a winner? But people can pick winners. Markets, people who spend money in a local area actually create those markets. That's how markets operate, right? So it's trying to sort of stimulate those markets again, I guess, in a way which can actually create these positive multipliers.
That's helpful. Thank you. And Anna, one question for you, and I'm just going to be devil's advocate due to your full-throated view on UBI and saying that people become beholden to the state. Let's all be honest with ourselves. There are people that are beholden to the state on the current welfare system. Not all, but there are some. And so therefore, how is UBI different from the current welfare state, which basically encourages people not to work? And you use the two-child benefit cap, which I entirely support keeping the cap. I don't think it should be removed. So therefore, how can, what is the difference between what you are proposing, which is, and David made this point as well, additional spending on various things, which I'm not saying I disagree with, but like free school meals and things like that. How is that not create an increased welfare system which keeps people within those parameters and encourages them not to go out, work out those longer hours and contribute back into the tax system?
Okay,
I'm being devil's advocate. I don't support UBI, but I'm just testing the theory.
It's about the simplicity. It's about the lever. If you've got a welfare system, I'm talking about the sort of cash transfer elements of it now, that is quite diffused among different things that you need to apply for and so on, then it's a more complicated business to turn it off. UBI you can turn off just like that. That's a worry. I mean, it's not my main objection. My main objection is the power that it gives to the state or the government to use it as a political football, to use it as a political bribe, and then say, well, we'll have to cut this service or that service so that we can pay for UBI, and to use it to buy votes. I'm really worried about that. But we were talking earlier about jobs, and I did make this point before, but I want to underline it, please. If we want to regenerate the local economy, what better way to start regenerating it than to create or to build or support or improve a range of local services? You get people in jobs, they're good jobs, those people will use that money and they will go out and spend it in the local economy. But in doing that, through the jobs they're doing, they will also be helping to make people feel more secure, less poor, reducing inequalities, improving the general quality of life in that community. So it's a different mechanism. So there's that thing to bear in mind as well. So yeah, I think that's where I stand.
Okay.
Assembly Member Plansky.
Thank you. Anna, I feel like there's a tautology to your argument because you're saying that there shouldn't be a trial because it's not replicable and it can't be scaled up. But the whole point of the trial is to look if something is replicable and scaled up when you get good outcomes from it. And the conversation in the second half has very much been about the outcomes as people have more money. But there's lots of evidence from the pilots around the world that universal basic income results in better nutritional rates, women's empowerment, access to education, people being able to do things. And I feel like our fundamental disagreement is that you think people should be able to do that through services, and I agree we should have better services without a doubt. But also there's the freedom argument that people, if they have the money, are able to spend the money as they wish and they have the freedom and independence to do that. It sounds like you support the potential trial in Camden for care experienced young people, which semantics aside, I would say is a basic income trial. It's just not universal. And I would like to see if that works in Camden for all London care experienced young people and indeed all national care experienced young people to get a basic amount of money to rebalance the fundamental inequalities that we know that care experienced young people face. In fact, this committee have done lots of work around care experienced young people. So I feel like opposing the trial on the basis that the trial might not be scalable is throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Not when you look at the body of evidence that's already there from other trials. I've read those results, those evaluations of all those trials. I did a study of them a few years ago. Every single UBI trial that we could lay our hands on, every single evaluation, and I don't think we will learn anything more. All we will learn is that it can't be scaled up in the London area, or let alone in the UK. So we'll learn that. I mean, if we learn that people are better off if you give them money, we know that already, as you've said. So what's the point? Why waste money on that? Now, if you're talking about a trial in Camden with care leavers, and you want to call that basic income, well, call it basic income. I think it's very misleading because of all the baggage that is attached to that term, basic income or universal basic income. I would call it something else, but if you want to call it basic income, call it basic income. Let's do it. And it's a very manageable scheme, but you want to do it in accompaniment with the other things that are happening in Camden that look at transport, digital access, housing, and so on. Or, get something together that sees people in the round and not just put money in their pockets and it'll be fine. It's not. So I don't think there is any tautology in my argument, actually, because I hate the idea of poor old London doing this scheme. It'll be all over the papers. And then, what do you do at the end? Then you pay someone like Matthew to evaluate it for you. And people love to evaluate these things. And by the way, you've had 5 people in the last session all talking about how wonderful UBI is. And now you've only got 2 against it. So I worry about that a bit. Anyway, then you pay for an evaluation, and the evaluation says, well, people are very happy. You're not going to learn anything new.
But the body of evidence shows that no one's shown the global leadership in terms of going, we're going to do this in this city and we'll be supported by national government. But we had a London mayor who ran around the city saying a Labour mayor plus a Labour government is the wind in the sails. So actually there's a real unique moment in London to go, we can demonstrate how this works and then make the case to national government where I'm not making a party political point, just the fact that the two from the same party means that there's a very clear route to going, OK, let's do the trial. And if that works, and if it doesn't work, then obviously you ditch it.
There are so many other things that would be more important to do. I mean, for a start, tackle the housing crisis.
Right.
But why go through UBI, which isn't going to help the housing crisis, which isn't going to help poverty, which isn't only going to affect a small people in a very small area if you just do a pilot anyway? So if you want to do something and bring together the political will of our wonderful Labour government with the political will of the Mayor of London, then do it on transport, on housing, on childcare, on adult social care if you could. There are all sorts of other things you could do it on that would be far more productive and have a much longer life expectancy, be much more sustainable than just a UBI pilot.
I mean, it sounds like until everything's perfect, then we can try a UBI pilot. But anyway, OK, thank you.
It's a tired old idea. It's
the challenge for us now is to go, where do we go next? The debate has been really, really interesting. And it was absolutely brilliant to have the guests that we've had today. Yes, very quickly. Yes, we can.
Just in listening to different sides of the argument, I just very, very quickly, because I'm going to get the wrath of the chair, but in thinking about UBI trials and the supposition that, the trials are all one-sided, they're all about giving more money rather than looking at it wider, would it not sort of prove quite similar to look at a group of people who've had, let's say, a pay rise this year, or they work in the public sector and they had a 3% pay rise, or you could isolate a group. You could take, say, London firefighters. They've now had this uplift in their salary. Would that not be similar than doing a small-scale trial of, say, 15 people? Because you then have more people who already have this. You could study that instead to look at what more money does. Because where I'm concerned about a very small-scale UBI trial is you're not gathering that wider evidence. You're just seeing what people do with a bit more money. Is there evidence based on where people have had pay rises, where you've had income levels raised, rather than doing a UBI trial per se?
You could try asking people what they thought about raising the London living wage.
That's my point. I mean, there's so many more people who are in that boat than would be, let's say 15 people, which would be much smaller. Okay, anyway, thank you, Chair.
Well, thank you. I think, Anna, the first time I've ever heard that London's been it's called poor old London, we've been arguing the case that we do need to fight for London to make sure that we're pushing the needs for London and Londoners, and if anything we can do as a committee, that will be the first premise. But we do have a challenge to go ahead to try and make sure that we have a report that is balanced as well. We've got two very good panels that have given some really excellent positions. And I'm sure that will be reflected in the report that we do. But we do have a challenge, Assembly members, to go forward on this. And I really appreciate the guests that we've had today. We have reached the end of our session. I would like to thank all of our guests for attending this meeting, for all their contributions. The committee has a few more items of business to deal with, but please feel free to leave the chamber while we deal with those if you wish. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion? Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from this discussion? Can I ask the committee to note the work programme and the meeting dates as agreed by the London Assembly at its annual meeting on the 6th of May 2025 and the additional activity undertaken since its last meeting as specified in the agenda report? Yep. And the next meeting of the committee will be held on the 16th of July 2025 at 2 o'clock in the chamber at City Hall. I have no urgent business, which concludes today's meeting.